Malcolm X in Africa, and the Caribbean. Lost 30 years after Malcolm X's assassination, his autobiography continues to sell more than 150,000 Colombian pesos (IES) a year, and a spate of books, articles, and films in the 1990s have generated a groundswell of interest in the man who redefined America through his analysis of racism and his activism in the service of black liberation worldwide. But, in the process, as Jan Carew observes in The Significance of Malcolm's Legacy has often eluded us. The real Malcolm, he writes, was far more complex than the millions of words written about him, the speeches that he made, or the plethora of distorted images strewn in the wake of his untimely death. Combining the lyricism of the poet with the breadth of the scholar, Carew, whose conversations with Malcolm in Britain influenced the revolutionary's thinking toward the end of his life, captures Malcolm the intellectual in pursuit of a new vision of race and a global political movement uniting progressive blacks and whites. For the first time, readers will gain an intimate knowledge of Malcolm's breakthrough to an internationalist vision following his historic trip to Mecca, his travels throughout Africa, and his life among the black expatriate community in London. Central also to the intricate discussions that transpire between Malcolm and Carew is their common Caribbean heritage, which Carew unfolds in the first full-fledged treatment of the history of Malcolm's Grenadine and Garvate mother. Written by one of the major figures on the Pan-African political landscape in this century, Ghosts in Our Blood will deepen our understanding of the many forces that shaped Malcolm X. Furjoy, Shantoba, the late Victor Ramses, and my friend and countryman Miles Fitzpatrick preface the real Malcolm X was far more complex than the millions of empty words written about him, the speeches he made at different stages of his life, or the plethora of distorted images strewn in the wake of his untimely death. Over the decades since his death, there has been a concerted effort to iconize him and, in so doing, to distance him further and further from the mother who had given birth to him, his brothers and sisters, his wife and children, and his ancestors. By making him an icon, however, the host of idolaters and their numbers increase with each new generation are somehow reenacting the Antiochus legend. The higher their iconized figure is lifted above the earth, the weaker and more indistinct the real Malcolm X becomes in their imaginations. As a result, they are less inclined to heed his warnings and are more reluctant to live the austere life he had chosen. Ultimately, they find it impossible to truly dedicate their lives to the cause of black liberation for which he died. We need to bring Malcolm back to earth and to humanize his memory. The time has come to frame him against the background of an extended family and then place him in the context of the larger community of people in America and abroad who influenced him and whom he, in turn, influenced. By an accident of fate, I met Malcolm X at the end of the most important 14 months in his political life. In just over a year, he had broken away from Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam, founded the Organization of African Unity and Muslim Mosque, 7mm Incorporated, made a second pilgrimage to Mecca, and declared in major speeches, both in the United States and abroad, that he was willing to join forces with all people fighting for freedom from oppression. It was during these hectic months, too, that he was reunited with his mother after 25 years. Malcolm seemed to be racing against time during that final year of his life. Between December 1964 and February 1965, he visited Britain twice. In the course of those visits he made the most sophisticated, brilliant, and conciliatory speeches of his career. In early December, immediately after his second pilgrimage to Mecca, he took part in a debate at the Oxford Union, one of the most famous debating societies in the English-speaking world. On February 11, less than 3 months later, he was invited back to London by the African Society to address a large audience in the Old Theatre at the London School of Economics. In both addresses, Malcolm moved the political discourse from civil rights to human rights and stated clearly and unequivocally that the black liberation struggle had to be internationalized rather than ghettoized. He also affirmed with the passionate conviction that was his trademark his willingness to work with people of goodwill regardless of their race, color, or creed. I was informed of Malcolm's presence in London while I was attending a grand, Very British reception at the Commonwealth Institute to celebrate the first issue of Magnet, a newspaper I had founded to reach the black readership in Britain. Responding to a last-minute invitation to the reception, Malcolm turned up, displaying grace and impeccable good manners as I introduced him to friends, acquaintances, diplomats, and journalists. Our conversations, which form the basis for this book, began late that night of the reception and continued over the next 2 days until his speech at the London School of Economics. Little did I know that these conversations would be my first and last with this inspirational revolutionary. A week after returning to the United States, Malcolm X would be assassinated. When Malcolm came to Britain, he was welcomed by a third-world immigrant population drawn mostly from the West Indies, Jan R Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. As a descendant himself from a Grenadian mother, as a Pan-Africanist and a Garvate, and as a Muslim, Malcolm in 1965 could reach people from a broad range of backgrounds. Of all that I knew about Malcolm X, what intrigued me most in the years after his assassination was that his Grenadian mother had been almost invariably passed over in biographical writings about him. I was not convinced firmly of the importance of this missing Caribbean link until I was visiting Bacolod, Grenada, in 1980 and happened upon the village matriarch, Tanta Bess. The oral tradition is alive and well in Tanta Bess, who had grown up with Louise Langdon Norton Little, Malcolm's mother. Listening to Tanta Bess, I could hear echoes of my mother's voice as she sat at the head of a long table supervising my history homework, inquiring wisely, "Didn't these great men in your history book, Drake, Hawkins, Raleigh, and the others, have grandmothers, mothers, sisters, aunts, wives, or did they just fall out of the sky like stones?" I discovered in talking with Tanta Bess that Malcolm did not just fall out of the sky like a stone, but that the man he would become was shaped in no small measure by his Grenadian mother. And yet, my conversations with Malcolm in 1965, my chance encounter with Tanta Bess more than a decade later, and my growing interest in exploring the influence of Louise Little on her famous son were not brought into clear focus until I met Paul Lee, a bright young research scholar, who introduced me to Malcolm's brother Wilfred in 1990. Wilfred, I soon learned, was not only one of Paul's mentors, he was also the mentor to several generations of black youth in Detroit. My first serious conversations with Wilfred took place in 1991 at his home in Detroit and at mine in Bloomington, Illinois. In talking about his mother, he also provided insights into life in the Little household in Omaha, Nebraska, in the Indiana Harbor area, where Earl Little was the chief representative of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, and in Lansing, Michigan, where the family moved in 1928. Ghosts in OIR Blood. Both Earl Little and Louise Langdon Norton, who had met at a Garvate meeting in Montreal in 1918, were profoundly influenced by and devoted followers of Garvey and his UNIA. Garvey was a self-educated Jamaican who had emerged from anonymity in the early 20th century to create a worldwide black nationalist movement. His UNIA was based in the United States and had its largest mass following there. He had declared, "I know no national boundary where the Negro is concerned. The whole world is my province until Africa is free." After meeting in Montreal, Earl and Louise were married in 1919 and moved to the United States, where they raised 7 children, of whom Wilfred was the eldest and Malcolm the 4th. Wilfred insisted that his father never was a Baptist preacher, as so many biographers have claimed. He was, Wilfred declared emphatically, a Garvate activist whom sympathetic black ministers allowed to address their congregations from time to time. When Earl Little was in his prime, Wilfred asserted, he was the strongest man I ever knew. But he was crushed under a streetcar in Lansing in 1931, when Wilfred was 12 and Malcolm 6. Louise Little and other UNIA members believed that Earl was beaten and thrown to his death by vigilantes from the Black Legion, a splinter group of the Ku Klux Klan. Perhaps most important for a complete portrait of Malcolm X, Wilfred painted a vivid picture of his mother's courage and perseverance in maintaining her family's life after the untimely death of her husband. The Louise Little portrayed by Wilfred was a talented and courageous woman who was consistently treated with cruelty and insensitivity by racist and sexist officials. The culmination of this tale of persecution came in 1939, when Louise, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, was committed to the Michigan State Mental Hospital at Kalamazoo. She would remain there for 25 years until Malcolm and other family members had her released into their care. Malcolm is reputed to have said that his reunion with his mother was the happiest moment of his life. I was impelled to write this book so that new dimensions of 11 Malcolm X's life could be brought to light. In the course of a relatively short lifetime, Malcolm threaded his way through a bewildering array of experiences that mirrored the inequalities, the tensions, the racism, and the hope in our society. His principal legacy is his examination of the United States and its worldwide imperialist extensions from the bottom looking upward. Conspicuously absent from his often searing analysis of race and class in America and abroad, therefore, was any trace of the dishonest intellectual palliatives that scholars from both the left and the right use to obfuscate the truth as they peer from the top looking downward. He taught us that it is the duty of leaders to be as devastatingly critical of their own mistakes as of their opponents. During my conversations with Malcolm, he never failed to state unequivocally that the system he was attacking was one based on unbridled greed, on the exploitation of one race by another and one class by another, and that it had to be radically transformed. He also made it clear that his role as a leader was not just to analyze the world, but to change it. 1. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. William Blake. An obscure vision, obscure because he dared not free it from his consciousness and examine it, he was content to half look at it, and seek no explanation. Miguel Angel Asturias, Men of Corn. It was a February morning in Wimbledon when I heard the news of Malcolm X's assassination. On that fateful morning, as I lay in bed, the sun's eye twice peered through slits in low-hanging clouds that were scattered above London like looted bales of soot-smudged cotton. It was as if that luminous eye was surveying my southwestern corner of London with a furtive glance, scanning rooftops, vehicles beetling their way through wet streets, dark trees with skeletal limbs raised imploringly toward heaven, and stretches of Wimbledon common carpeted with dead leaves and frost-singed grass. By the time the second shaft of sunlight had shot through my bedroom window, I was already fully awake. I thought of going for my usual run on Wimbledon Common, but I was tired after having 1. Barely snatched 4 hours sleep, and my good intentions evaporated like apparitions in a fog. I turned on my side and noticed a patina of frost on the branches of the gnarled copper beech in my back garden. A pair of starlings, perched on a high branch, fluffed out their feathers and huddled close together. I spoke softly to the starlings, but they buried their heads in their feathers, and for a moment I wished that I could bury my own head under the covers for the rest of my life. If you were like me, a black man from Guyana living alone in an old Victorian house after an acrimonious break with an angry English wife and 4 bewildered children, 3 English stepdaughters and one of my own, talking to birds, plants, trees, anything that was alive but not human, would seem to be a perfectly natural thing to do. Besides, Magnet, the weekly black newspaper I was editing, had finally rolled off the press at the end of a hectic 20-hour workday, and I was still in a stupor of exhaustion. But the sunlight, even appearing and vanishing as swiftly as it had done, also awakened some sleeping thoughts that burned so brightly in my brain that even after pulling the covers over my head I could not banish them. What am I doing here in this inhospitable country with its miserable climate? I asked myself, as I had often done on so many twilight mornings. You're a man from a land of sun and trade winds and a sea of evergreen forests. Why on earth? But I'd invariably cut short that sorry for myself lament and remind myself loudly, well, you can't eat sun or drink the trade winds. Besides, the British are there in your country living off the fat of the land. And even if they left, they'd still be sucking its wealth dry from across the Atlantic. So whether or not the British are cold, boorish, racist to the marrow of their bones, and the English climate is lousy, you'd better just stay here and collect a little of what they owe you. The fact is, though, that I had ended up in Wimbledon, a middle-class English sanctuary, because the former owner of my house, a Trotskyist member of parliament with an eccentric disdain for his comfortable, middle-class legacy, had sold it to me for a song. Coming to Britain had been perfectly natural. After all, it had been dinned into my head from as far back as I could remember that England was the mother country. Then, too, having arrived in London, I found that my colonial middle-class education helped to round off some of the sharp edges of the initial culture shock. This education included studying Latin, English, and European history along with a wide spectrum of English literature. What was studiously avoided was anything related to the history of Guyana, outside of its colonial connections. It was also because of this colonial education, which a cynical classmate had declared was designed to make us stupidly loyal to king, country, and the Union Jack, that I had christened my Wimbledon residence the House of Despair. "How come you chose such a morose name for your house?" several friends had inquired. "Everybody chooses cheerful, grandiose, or cute house names, so I decided to be different," I'd explain, but the real reason was more complicated. The truth is that when the solicitor was showing me around the house for the first time, he'd said facetiously that this Victorian mansion is divided into 3 parts, like Caesar's Gaul. And the mention of Caesar's Gaul immediately took me back to the days when I was a student at Berbice High School and had to study Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War for my junior Cambridge Latin exam. The rush of memories made me inattentive to his very English voice describing the property in some detail. I nodded and smiled foolishly while remembering how Raymoter, a Hindu classmate who was a midnight black madrasi with shiny patent leather hair and glittering eyes, had told me quite matter-of-factly, "You know, the blasted Julius Caesar, whose work we keep reciting like parrots, suffered from fits." Fits? Caesar? I recalled asking incredulously, because this piece of information about the great man's human frailty was suddenly far more interesting to me than his conquest of Gaul. "Yes, the damn man was an epileptic. Don't you remember the words from our memory passage in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar? 4. And when the fit was on him, I did mark how he did shake, 'tis true, this god did shake. His coward lips did from their color fly." Years later, I came to regret that I didn't listen more carefully to the solicitor when he was showing me around the house. An unusually heavy snowfall and the prolonged cold spell that came in its wake caused the outside pipes to burst and sprout stalactites, and I had to live without running water for weeks. The House of Despair turned out to be a very appropriate name for my Wimbledon residence, since, in addition to burst pipes, my bittersweet life in London was strewn with love affairs, anti-colonial activity, solitary periods of writing and painting, and wild spells of carousing followed by bouts of melancholy. Then there was that painful, traumatic discovery that we people of color make after arriving in the mother country and finding out, with a naive colonial dismay, that there's no black in the Union Jack. Visitors who traveled by subway, after leaving Wimbledon Station, walking up High Street, and laboring up the steep hill to my house invariably accused me of failing to warn them that the hill was a brood. Winded West Indian visitors would sometimes even accord a living, patriarchal personality to the hill by declaring, "That's a hill, father, man. That blasted hill separates boys from men." I was the only one, the sole West Indian living on our street. Guests who did not know my exact address could knock on any door along the street and ask about the house in which a tall black man lived, and with an excessive show of British middle-class politeness, any neighbor could direct them to number 58. As I was sitting at the side of my bed with a blanket wrapped around me, JD, a Jamaican friend who worked for the BBC, phoned. "You heard the news?" "What news?" I asked. I knew from the agitation in his voice and the fact that he had shed his BBC British accent that something calamitous had happened. "Malcolm, man." "Malcolm?" "Yes, man, Malcolm X, him dead, assassinated, them blew him away. Ras, man, the brother was here only 12 days ago. Just over a week. Jesus Christ. And now them gone, I'm down in the Audubon ballroom where he was gwine talk bout his organization of Afro-American unity. Is the God's truth what him did say, that he was a marked man and some folks high up in Yankeeland had passed a death sentence pon. That them folks was more powerful than Elijah Muhammad and his black Muslims. Remember how him did say that the triggermen, the bombers, or whoever them sent gainst him would be the puppets, and above them would be a puppet master pulling the strings. If only the brother did listen to us, we did tell him say that he should live for the struggle, not die for it. His voice broke off, and I could hear someone talking to him. J.D. I said, urgently, because I wanted to hear more. I've got to go, old chap. I'm being summoned. The BBC treadmill calls. We'll contact you later. Almost as naturally as breathing, JD had switched back to an impeccable British accent. JD hung up before I could ply him with questions. I rushed downstairs to switch on the television. But standing before the charcoal gray screen, I changed my mind. If Malcolm was indeed dead, then I'd defer facing that ugly reality for the moment. I wanted him to be alive, and if I ignored the TV news for a while I could pretend that he was, that he'd taken our advice and gone into hiding. I slumped down on a couch, and it was as if the wind outside had sneaked under the French windows in my study and gripped my heart with icy fingers. Why did you choose to die, Malcolm? I shouted at the empty room. Don't we have enough martyrs? It's time that we lived for the struggle, and not just keep dying for it. When I finally switched on the television, images of a body lying was meant to jolt the president into acknowledging that there was a wide chasm between his soaring vision and the reality of Ghana's shaky infrastructure. Shortly after covering that opening of the Akosombo Dam, Anthony was back in Ghana again to report for the BBC on an entirely different event. While President Nkrumah was on his way to a peace mission in Hanoi, his government was overthrown by a cabal of high-ranking military officers. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, all of the senior officials who supported Nkrumah were being rounded up and imprisoned in the name of a junta calling itself the National Liberation Council. This junta, in the midst of making hypocritical noises about democracy, was in the process of releasing one batch of political prisoners and replacing them in the prisons with another group. Since soldiers had already visited my lodgings when I was not at home, I knew that my arrest was imminent. I also knew that if my arrest was publicized abroad, the likelihood of my disappearing without a trace would be considerably reduced. When he left Ghana this second time, Anthony took a coded message to Andrew Salke, a trusted friend and colleague, for me. It was signed Black Midas, the title of my first novel. I knew that once Andrew got hold of this coded missive, he would take immediate steps to publicize the news of my arrest. And that was exactly what happened. However, Anthony told me afterwards that his BBC superiors had reprimanded him, claiming that by helping me he had compromised the BBC's role of impartiality. 30 years later, while reminiscing about the past on a popular radio show in Kingston, Jamaica, and Urbane, Rotund Anthony and I began talking about our days in Ghana, about Malcolm's visit to Oxford, and about their participation in the Oxford Union debate. After leaving the broadcasting studio, I could not help thinking that the Africa Malcolm had envisaged spawning a plethora of liberation movements that would unite the continent and end white economic domination in short order had hardly a decade after his death been riven, splintered, and further balkanized by a 71. Succession of brutal coups d'état. In addition, as the Cold War intensified, the new U.S. anti-insurgent policy of low-intensity conflict devastated and impoverished vast areas of the ancestral homeland for which Malcolm had had such great expectations. Some people now claim that it is fortunate Malcolm did not live to see the end of the Cold War and the disasters on the African continent preceding the Cold War's demise. Those successive disasters, they say, make the brutal imperialist intervention in the Congo that he had so graphically described seem mild by comparison, and this would have filled him with despair. Others, however, point out that had he lived, his resolve would have been unshaken, and he would have continued to give heart to those still fighting to make the African dream of unity and freedom a reality. I left Jamaica shortly after taking part in that radio show with Anthony, but I had asked Dermot Hussey to do a tape recording of Anthony talking about Malcolm's visit to Oxford and their joint participation in the debate. In the interview with Dermot, the Jamaican inflections in Anthony's voice were as familiar to me as they had been 3 decades before. "Where shall I begin?" was his opening gambit. "At the beginning," was Dermot's rejoinder. "Well, here goes. There's a tradition that the president of the Oxford Union would, at the end of his term, in what they call the presentation debate, invite the person in Britain whom he most admires. For me, that person wasn't British, and they appreciated the fact that I wouldn't necessarily have chosen someone British, so they asked if there was anybody from Jamaica or anywhere else that I would like to invite. I said, yes, Malcolm X. Malcolm who? The man in America who's causing all those problems. That's the sort of reaction I got. I think they thought he was Martin Luther King. They didn't seem to know the difference. Anyhow, they agreed, and we made contact with Malcolm X and sent the necessary tickets and what have you, but it turned out at the last moment that he called and said he wouldn't be able to make it because he was going to Mecca. We spoke again, and he then agreed that on his way back from Mecca, he would pass through Britain. And he did. He came up to 72. Oxford and spent 4 days with me. The 4 days, of course, included the Thursday night of the debate. I think he came on Tuesday or Wednesday and stayed till Friday. Well, I've always followed the American civil rights struggle, and I saw him as very much the person who was making the most sense to me. I didn't believe in those days that nonviolence was going to be the answer. In fact, I really am surprised at the extent to which America, short of a violent overthrow or a violent upsurge, would have agreed to go along with the degree of social changes that have taken place. So my hopes were on Malcolm X, not on Martin Luther King. I saw Martin Luther King as, well, I saw him as someone complementary to Malcolm, but my man was always Malcolm. There are a couple of things that stick in my memory. First of all, when he came, I had been gated confined to my gates after 6 in the evening because in the term before, I had participated in a demonstration protesting the arrest of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Now, Malcolm wasn't my guest in Oxford, he was the guest of the Oxford Union. We had planned a whole series of events for him for those 4 nights. But the minute he heard that I was gated for my role in the Mandela demonstrations, he said he wasn't going to attend any of those events either. You know, that was rather nice. So every night he came to my apartment during the time he was there. And that was an experience. Because president of the Oxford Union sort of the center of a lot of student activities, and you don't become president of the Oxford Union on a black vote. So there were lots of white friends dropping in, and so forth and so on. And Malcolm would hold forth every night during the 4 nights and 4 days he was there. I was sharing this apartment with Richard Fletcher. Richard is now with the American Development Bank, and we opened the doors between our 2 rooms, and sort of turned the 2 rooms into a mini mall. And Malcolm would sit there and talk to those white students. If there were 40 students there at a time, 36 of them would be white. And he would talk about white devils. I remember that phrase, white devils. I remember sitting there and 73. Hearing him talk about white devils, and the white students would clap. I thought that was a most remarkable experience. Here was this man talking about racial injustice, and, well, he didn't mince words. If you looked at his thoughts, they were not violent thoughts, they were reasoned thoughts. But his language was violent. I really mean it, he didn't mince words. And seeing those white kids cheering this man who was talking about white oppression was really something. I remember that very clearly. I also remember walking with him in Oxford. We went through the Oxford Union building where there were photographs of all the previous presidents and their presidential debates, and in all those photographs, everybody taking part in those debates, as was the tradition for several hundred years, was dressed in tails. We would wear tails and waistcoats and white, starched formal attire. He saw all this, and it immediately dawned on him that he didn't have tails. In fact, that he hadn't come to Oxford to wear tails. So I told him immediately, "You don't have to wear tails." I didn't tell him that I'd already raised the question with my committee and everyone had agreed to make this exception for him. He said nothing. And we walked out and about. You know, we must have walked for about 25 yards when he turned to me and said, "I really don't like wearing tails, but if it's going to be any embarrassment to you at all, I'd be happy to wear tails." I just thought that in those days you would hardly expect anyone from the radical side of things to make that kind of concession. Perhaps that was indicative of how much he had changed since his early days of hot gospeling. We spent a lot of time discussing his relationship with Martin Luther King and the whole civil rights movement in America. He told me that he and Martin corresponded and that they spoke to each other, but there were real differences between them, even though the differences were sincere and genuine ones. Yes, Malcolm never spoke disparagingly of him at all. He confided that even if King's approaches were right, he felt that his approach, at worst, would facilitate King's approach. I thought that was very good. The other thing I remember is that I had a girlfriend, well, not 74 exactly a girlfriend, but one of the young ladies around the Oxford Union with whom I was very friendly. And she, listening to this man every night, really became fascinated, hanging on every word. She came to me one night and said, "Can we take him home tonight?" I said to her, "Look, this is a religious man, you know." She looked at me sort of feeling, "Which of you can escape us?" So I allowed her to take him home, and I wasn't surprised when she came back rather speedily, sort of surprised that there was this rare black man who turned down a beautiful woman. Which again reinforced for me, in a very small and insignificant way, I suppose, his integrity. The actual motion of the debate was "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." This was a statement made by Barry Goldwater from the far right, and I had adopted it as the motion. You must understand that at Oxford, Cambridge is the only other place that exists, and vice versa. The Oxford boat race is all about beating Cambridge, and with cricket it's the same thing. It was crucial that the president of the Oxford Union win the debate against his Cambridge opponent. But Malcolm was not the usual protagonist. Usually, it was someone from within, a member of the House of Commons or some such individual. Ted Heath, an ex-president of the Union who later became Prime Minister of Britain, was going to support the president of the Cambridge Union against Malcolm and me. But at the last moment he backed off. I don't think he wanted to cross swords with us. Instead, Humphrey Barclay, a Conservative member of Parliament and one who was quite liberal, took on the task. I must tell you, though, I was sorry for him. I have never been as sorry for a man as I was for Humphrey Barclay that night, because Malcolm took his speech and, I mean, he just tore him up. I myself was always careful in dealing with race with people on the other side of the aisle. I didn't want to ruffle their sensibilities too much. But with Malcolm and Humphrey, it was something else. The amazing thing, though, was to see those white people standing up and cheering Malcolm X. 75. As he demolished that white man. You know, certainly in terms of the Oxford of those days, Humphrey Barclay was a popular conservative, because he was a liberal conservative. I can't remember all the players in the debate that night. The main ones were Malcolm and I on one side, and Christy Davis and Humphrey Barclay on the other. Those are really my major recollections of the debate. But I remember that we would talk all day walking down and about Oxford. We'd go shopping and, you know, Malcolm X never repeated himself once in those 4 days. And, to me, his most interesting gift was his gift of analogy. He would make a point, and then he would use an analogy to illustrate that point. His use of analogy was absolutely brilliant, and his command of the English language was something extraordinary. And to me again, and you must remember that I am of the West in Oxford, I am very impressed with Oxford and would sort of tread gently on sensibilities, but to see Oxford bend down at the knees to a black man was remarkable, because that is what happened that week. I mean, in the Oxford Union, you are amongst the cream of the English students. It's a place where you congregate. It's not just beer cellars and libraries and so forth. Yet within 4 days, I mean, we had no room in my flat at night. It was like a movie house with people lined up and trying to get in. In the crowded room, 6 would go out and then 6 would come in. The overall thing is that he would speak and they would cheer. The way in which he reached people was very reasoned. It was never abusive. I remember, too, that he was of the firm view that the American government was out to kill him. He spoke very disparagingly of Elijah Muhammad in terms of his visit to Mecca. I think that is where his death might have come from because, reinforced with his visit to Mecca, he probably would have started his own church, something much more fundamental than Muhammad in terms of being true to Islam. He was very, very preoccupied with the possibility of his death. I'm not absolutely certain, but my recollection is that he was more fearful of the American government authorities than he was of Elijah Muhammad. J76 Ghosts I/OIR Blood. We discussed his role in the struggle, and he saw it as critical in terms of supporting the nonviolent groups. At that time, Martin Luther King was very much the recognized black leader, and attempts were being made to paint Malcolm as some kind of lunatic extremist. He answered that allegation with reasoned arguments, and that was impressive about the man. You didn't get the impression that there was any prejudice in him at all. I think that is what those English students might have sensed that his American white audiences might not have sensed, that this was not a man motivated by hatred of white people. This was a man who operated at a totally cerebral level. You got the feeling that you were dealing with a very careful, scholarly man who saw clear distinctions and who could illuminate those distinctions by analogy. I had expected to meet someone who was hurt, angry, quarrelsome, bitter. This wasn't the case. He was totally cerebral, totally intellectual, and a non-emotional person. It would surprise many black and white Americans to hear Malcolm described as totally cerebral and totally intellectual. That, however, was how he was perceived by many who heard him debate at the Oxford Union, speak at the London School of Economics, and address audiences in France and in several African countries. The way that the Oxford Union debate was reported by the Western media, however, when it was reported at all, reminds me of Rashomon, that imaginative Japanese film directed by Kurosawa. In it, 7 eyewitnesses give completely contradictory accounts of the same event. As the story unfolds in scene after scene, it is hard to believe that those eyewitnesses are talking about the same event. The BBC television, using a short excerpt from Malcolm's speech and deliberately placing it out of context, was operating very much in the Rashomon tradition. The easily forgettable witticisms of Christy Davis were highlighted and Humphrey Barclay's tepid peroration given much play. The fact is, though, that Barclay had made the mistake of calling Malcolm North America's leading exponent of apartheid and adding insult to 77. Injury. He said that liberty to him means racial segregation. Barclay paid dearly for this when Malcolm demolished his insults and arguments with a calculated and remorseless logic. The motion that was debated was, in fact, one of the more famous statements on extremism made by Barry Goldwater at the Cow Palace in San Francisco when he accepted the Republican nomination for the American presidential election. There had been an attempt by more moderate Republicans to induce the party to condemn certain extremist right-wing groups, especially the John Birch Society, but Goldwater had brushed this aside and had given, it seemed at the time, a green light to these right-wing groups that veered close to the lunatic fringe. But subsequent events proved that Goldwater had greater prescience than his detractors had credited him with. He foresaw the national shift to the right more clearly than they did. In order to discredit whatever Malcolm said during the debate, the BBC announcers made sure to point out that among those arguing in favor of the motion were Malcolm X, one of the leaders of the black Muslims in America, and Hugh McDermott, a Scottish nationalist who, even more dreadful than being black, radical, and a nationalist, had the malice to be a communist. So Malcolm was, by implication, firmly relegated to an extremist corner. The contumacious labels were meant to intimate to the viewers that these two debaters were not to be taken seriously no matter what they said. Incidentally, Malcolm was, at the time, no longer a black Muslim, a point he made very clearly at the beginning of his speech when he said, "I am a Muslim and my religion is Islam. As a Muslim, I believe in the brotherhood of all peoples, and I am absolutely against discrimination in any shape or form." The BBC commentators, however, deliberately chose to ignore these statements. They wanted to demonize Malcolm and portray him as a bigot. A black male truth-teller was a threat to their cozy and racist beliefs. Nevertheless, there was still much that could be seen even on the edited tapes of the BBC. Anthony Abraham set the tone of the 78 Ghosts I/01 R Blood debate when he opened his arguments by appealing to the audience not to concern itself with Goldwater, but rather to concentrate on the matter of political principle. To defend this statement, I would like to start with a quotation that is only too well known, but only too easily forgotten: "Man is born free, but is now everywhere in chains. What greater right does a man have but his freedom?" And it is my contention tonight that any man or any nation who seeks to deny another man or another nation of his liberty is, by definition, an extremist. He has striven to take away a man's most basic right, and we must be extremely vicious in our reaction to such men. Because, what are the methods they use? Which despot, which dictator ever threatened another's liberty with reason and moderation? Which nation was ever subjugated in a gentlemanly fashion? A few days ago, I spoke in the Cambridge Union on the use of violence in South Africa. On that occasion, the argument which the moderates advanced was simply this: think about the innocent women and children in South Africa. It is my contention that this is the price we have to pay for liberty. Britain didn't ask, what about the innocent women and children in Nazi Germany? Britain couldn't even ask, what about the women and children of this country? The oppressor uses force and understands nothing else. If we are afraid to meet oppression with extreme action, then we will be oppressed. We are free because we fought to protect our freedom. Tomorrow we will be enslaved if we falter. Abrahams, Malcolm, and McDermott were, in fact, taking the Goldwater quote and using it in a fashion that its author could never possibly have imagined when he trumpeted it at the Cow Palace. Goldwater had used it to endorse white bigotry, while they turned it around and used it in defense of liberty and freedom from racism for all people. McDermott began by lampooning the doctrine of moderation in all things and declaring that it was the most abominable, anti-vital doctrine that was ever promulgated in the history of mankind. He followed up this opening salvo with the William 79. Blake dictum that the road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom and, in a more serious vein, declared, "I know no national liberation movement that has been won without a terrible struggle, without civil disobedience, violence, war, or civil war." This heretical Scotsman then threw in a number of quotes from Mao Zedong. What is the strength of the imperialists? It lies only in the unconsciousness of the people, and humanity is in its infancy. When it is full grown, what will it make of our world? But after ruminating over the arguments of all the speakers, those for and those against the motion, I always return to Malcolm's eloquent and unequivocal advocacy of a genuine racial democracy, for it continues to have an authentic and contemporary ring to it after 30 years. In retrospect, the arguments raised in opposition to Malcolm merely provide us with an entertaining discourse. At the end of his historic Oxford Union debate, Malcolm, with subtlety and aplomb, slipped in a quotation from Hamlet's timeless soliloquy to reinforce his concluding arguments. He introduced the quotation by saying that Hamlet, when he launched himself into the soliloquy, was apparently reluctant to make up his mind, at which the audience laughed heartily. But when the laughter died down, Malcolm's mood changed from a bemused jocularity to a somber earnestness. He made it quite clear what he meant by the terms moderation on the one hand and extremism on the other, and he did this by adding his own comments to Shakespeare's passage. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether white is nobler in the mind to suffer. the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Ironically, further on in that soliloquy, one finds much else that touched on Malcolm's imminent death at the hands of assassins. 80 Ghosts I/01 are blood for who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely. The law's delay, the insolence of office and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. Malcolm was aware that powerful and malevolent enemies had decided to kill him. He understood more profoundly than most that with the ferment in the ghettos, on the streets, and on the campuses, a decision had been made by senior policy makers in Washington to discredit, buy off, imprison, or kill progressive leaders, particularly those of color, and to substitute the pimps, drug dealers, and gangsters as role models for the young. Because of this, Malcolm was determined to denounce racism, trumpet a message of black pride, and affirm as an Afro-Carib shaman had done that all peoples have a right to share the waters of the river of life, and to drink with their own cups, but our cups have been broken. Malcolm insisted that we not only have to mend our broken cups, but that we have to have a say in how the waters of the river of life should be shared. 5. But that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will. Shakespeare, Hamlet. Malcolm was pensive for a while. Then he said, "You know, I get into the strangest discussions with you. Usually, I just don't have the time for exchanges like this. Maybe flew never island you in a hotel room in a foreign country before," I pointed out. As if to underline the fact that our conversations could take us down unusual intellectual paths, he said, "I liked the way Shakespeare portrayed that Hamlet guy. Read the play in prison, and learned whole passages by heart. So that's why you ended your Oxford Union debate with to be or not to be, that is the question. You remember?" He seemed genuinely surprised and pleased. The Malcolm X that the press portrays is hardly one who would quote Shakespeare so aptly, I said. Tony Abrahams told me afterwards that it really shocked them when I laid that quotation on them, he said with a mischievous grin. To use a British understatement, I, too, was mildly surprised, I said. 81. 82. That Hamlet guy was really mixed up. He couldn't make up his mind about some things, but he loved his father and never forgave his mother for betraying him and then jumping right into marriage with the uncle, he said. The fellow sounded too good to be true, I said, because Malcolm had looked away from me and seemed to be mulling over sad and private thoughts. Who, Hamlet? He asked absent-mindedly. No, his father. The fellow was so perfect that his wife obviously began to find him a bit of a bore, and when the fun-loving and unscrupulous uncle came along, she fell for his line of sweet talk. Now Hamlet, on the other hand, was in love not with a flesh and blood mother but with a perfect being he had created in his imagination, and when he saw her having a ball with his raunchy uncle, jealousy began to gnaw at his guts. There was an awkward silence, which he broke by returning, somewhat good-naturedly, to the issue of ancestral links by confessing that the Chinese and Arabs he'd met had also asked him about his family history. It took me a while, he confessed ruefully, to realize that they were not just making polite small talk, but trying to find out who I really was. I'll start digging into the family history as soon as I'm back home, he promised. You should begin with your mother, I suggested. A Chinese proverb says that women hold up half the sky. I need time, Malcolm said, and I sensed that he was talking about much more than the immediate topic. To be or not to be, I said jokingly. When a man is pulled in several directions by doubts, the Russians, who are a very literary people, say that he's suffering from Hamletism. In short, you're implying that that's my complaint. Perhaps. But I've already made up my mind. You see, you have the option of staying here and spinning out theories, and I can't say in all honesty that I don't envy you. Those 4.5 days at Oxford were more stimulating intellectually than anything I had. 83. Experienced on the street or in my locked-away, mind blinkered black Muslim period. But it was the sum total of all my experiences, good and bad, that made the Oxford one so stimulating. If I stayed there too long, I'd just dry up and wither away. So I've got to go back to a brutal, racist country where our folks have to learn how to organize for self-defense. The theory has to be part of that struggle, or else it would be like froth that disappears before you can taste it. I know that you mean well with all this talk about ancestors and roots, and what did you call it? Hamletism. You're telling me in so many words that I shouldn't go back right now. But I've made up my mind, and I'm going back, he said, facing me. All right, I said, looking him in the eye, the real issue is this: our ancestors survived because there were those who were willing to live for the struggle, and those who were ready to die for it. I'm suggesting that you should seriously consider the option of living for the struggle, going into hiding, writing, studying, evolving. I'm certain that you'll never sell out. Before the Harper's Ferry raid, John Brown had a secret meeting with Frederick Douglass and pleaded with him to call for a general slave uprising. But if Douglass had done this, he'd have been a martyr, and after the bloodbath the black struggle would have been held in check for at least 50 years. Who knows? The black struggle might have advanced 100 years if he'd called for that uprising. Anyway, like I said before, I've made up my mind, he said, and the finality in his voice made it clear that he wasn't prepared to discuss the matter any further. He looked away from me and said thoughtfully, "My mind was closed when I was under Elijah Muhammad's influence. I was like a sleepwalker for 12 years, but my mind's wide awake now. And it's not just Elijah Muhammad, but white America that blinkers our minds. During my African visits, I talked to President Nasser, President Nyerere, President Kenyatta, President Azikiwe, President Nkrumah, President Sékou Touré, and Prime Minister Ben Bella, and there are others whose names I can't mention. They all shared some of their valuable time with me to discuss the plight 84 of Negroes in America and to talk about colonialism, racism, and the need for unity of the world's oppressed peoples. Not one of them bought the State Department propaganda about American Negroes being content with their lot as second-class citizens. I didn't for one moment flatter myself that I was some kind of special being talking to them, because I knew that through me they were expressing their solidarity with the 22 million oppressed Negroes in America. So they spent hours talking to me. Those talks broadened my outlook and made it crystal clear to me that I had to look at the struggle in America's ghettos against the background of a worldwide struggle of oppressed peoples. That's why, after every one of my trips abroad, America's rulers see me as being more and more dangerous. That's why I feel in my bones that the plots to kill me have already been hatched in high places. The triggermen will only be doing what they were paid to do. Listening to him and observing him as he moved restlessly around his hotel room, it occurred to me that during this visit to Britain he had become more aware of how others saw him. Realizing how intense he must have appeared, Malcolm occasionally paused, smiled, and relaxed. It was during one of these pauses that I steered our talk away from the morbid subject of the threats to his life and said, "The Ajahs of the Niger say that journeys to far places help to scrape you down to the simplest common denominator of what you really are as a human being." Scraping, huh? My father used to preach about the scales falling from people's eyes, but that African scraping deals with the whole body. Can you imagine our Toms being scraped down to the simplest common denominator of what they really are as human beings? He asked rhetorically. It would turn them into jellyfish, because it's only the crusts that are holding them up. After reflecting for a while, he asked, "Look, why not tell me more about yourself? How is it that you survived this scraping?" "Well, I suppose the scraping down didn't turn me into jelly, so I go around taking it for granted that I have a right to be here." "And you said that you're married to an English woman, an upper-class one." Jan Karen 85 That's right, my wife was married to an army colonel when I met her, and she had 3 children by him, and now she has a 4th by me. You met my daughter at the reception, remember?" He acknowledged that he had with a nod and a smile, and I continued, You see, in my Guyanese culture, if you fall in love with a woman and she has children, then it's natural as breathing to marry the woman and take her children under your wing as if they were your own. He laughed out loud, stood up, stretched, and, shaking his head, declared, "Brother Jan, you have problems. A white woman and her white children plus one of your own. In the States, rednecks would have tried to lynch you or bomb your house, and if that didn't work, they'd hound you down in the courts. And what does the Colonel think of all this? He's from the Scottish-Irish nobility. And his ancestors were professional soldiers and empire builders before him. He followed in their footsteps for a while, but he resigned from the army when they started planning to fight a nuclear war. He's a decent chap, one of those rare individuals who, despite being trained to be a racist from birth, isn't a racist. Race doesn't bother him, as the folks in Ghana say, at all at all. And what about your friends? What about them? Didn't any of them turn against you after you married a white woman? My friends don't mind, but my mother does. She wrote saying that she was glad that I was getting married and settling down, but couldn't I have married a nice young woman from home whose family she knew? She added that she hoped I wasn't planning to bring my English wife back to Guyana. You see, after having lived and worked in the States for years, she has an abiding suspicion of all white people. She divides them into three categories: those who act white, the majority, a small minority who in spite of the racism everywhere around them act like normal, decent human beings, then there are the rabid racists, whom she describes as human beasts. As for my friends, intermarriage is old hat. Since the 86 end of the war, it's become pretty commonplace. Sometimes the racism encourages rather than discourages it. There's a racist myth that every black man has a magical sugar stick between his legs. The word is out on the gossipgram over here that J. Edgar Hoover's obsessed with this myth of the black super stud. I heard this from a Negro journalist who was on the Washington beat. But isn't that the archetypal myth that's lodged in the mind of every white male, and the American white male in particular? And many white women believe it, too, while all too many Negro men try to live up to it. White racism credits us with having phenomenal sexual prowess, but it doesn't credit us with having much in the way of intelligence. And what about your wife's friends? She lost a couple, but of the ones who remained her friends, a few of them wanted to find out if sleeping with a black man did, indeed, bring magical sexual delights. Every time she turned her back, one of them tried to explore that myth with me. My wife's father, though, is a white settler in Kenya, and he refused to have anything to do with her. But, then again, she was a rape child. Her mother hated her, and she hated her mother right back. As for her father, during her entire adult life she must have seen him only half a dozen times. This is a strange place, Malcolm said. I've seen the insides of US cities, the raw insides, but, if anything, London's worse. I explained further why intermarriage wasn't anything unusual in Britain. At first, the immigrants were mostly male, but the gender thing became more balanced from the early 1950s onward. When I first came to Britain, women of color were, as we say in Guyana, scarcer than good gold. The situation here is different, Malcolm acknowledged once more, and I continued. Something that most people don't realize is this: yes, the British had an empire on which the sun never set, and although thousands of Britons fanned out to populate their empire, most of them stayed at home and lived both physically and mentally surrounded by picket fences and brick walls and hedges. Our ancestors didn't. 87. Travel of their own free will either, after that first, forced Atlantic crossing. So when we started immigrating to the mother country by the thousands, white, stay-at-home Britons began having permanent, swarthy next-door neighbors in large numbers for the first time. And with the loss of empire and the realization that British is no longer best, unprincipled politicians have begun to use us as ready-made scapegoats. You folks had better get your act together. Right now you have conversation, dialogue, but soon there'll be aggression, and when it reaches that stage, you're going to have to be ready and able to defend yourselves. You can take my word for it, law won't defend you, Malcolm warned. The aggression stage is already upon us, man, but it will take a long time and almost unbearable racist pressures for our dark million to realize that they must unite and link up with black and other third world peoples all over the world, I cautioned. Then you'd better get to work right away. That's what we're trying to do with Magnet. Garvey said that first we must change our way of thinking, and then, peacefully, fashion the weapons with which to fight, and we're trying to follow that Garvey advice. That's the only way we can survive with dignity as a people. Those are good points, Malcolm declared, nodding his approval, and I like that part about peacefully fashioning the weapons to fight with. That's good advice. You know, when it comes to race relations, the British are even more arrogant and ignorant than the most benighted white Americans. In their heart of hearts, they'd like to see every man, woman, and child of color dispatched to some faraway limbo land. The American whites, in the midst of their virulent race baiting, know in their bones that they need to have blacks around. Without those black-white hatreds to generate a certain kind of energy deep inside that nation's guts, the United States would suffer from a terrible sense of emptiness. Racism, the oppression and degradation of women, and multiple ethnic hatreds provide the glue that holds the aggressive, white, male-dominated, profit-hungry ruling 88 sectors of America together. I always remember how Chekhov, that Russian medical doctor turned writer, saw the human condition through sharply focused creative lenses when he wrote that mankind, take note, he didn't say womankind is more easily united by hatred, malice, greed, and envy than by ideas of love, charity, and compassion. The growing racism in Britain and Europe is living proof of this. But, in the same breath, as I mentioned before, black-white conversation below the waist is easier in these parts than it is in America. If black-white copulation could have solved the race question here, it would have done so long ago. But there's another side of the business of miscegenation that the whites never like to look at. Wherever the British and European males landed during the age of exploration and colonization, 9 months later there were children of mixed races born to native mothers. And with every corner of the earth being so easily accessible these days, the tempo of interracial mixing has increased. Here in Britain, interracial sex is pretty common, and it's been taking place since the time of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. She got so upset about the sizable black population in England that she passed an anti-black immigration law. Then more recently, during the 2 World Wars, thousands of West Indian, African, Afro-American, and colored Commonwealth servicemen and women helped to increase the mixed-race population. Malcolm brought me back to the story of my life in Britain when he asked with an amused insistence, "So what about this English colonel, the one whose wife you stole? Didn't I hear you say that you were still on friendly terms?" Stole is not the right word. I chided him, and he recanted. "All right, pitched some woo at and married. Yes, the colonel and I are friends. Relations between us have always been pretty cordial. After all, I had custody of his children." "It sure is different here," Malcolm acknowledged ruefully. "Before I went on my travels, I'd have denounced you as a traitor to the race. I might not even have believed your story, because I wouldn't have wanted to believe it." "Which race?" I asked facetiously, because here in Britain. 89. Black could mean black, brown, or yellow, West Indian, African, or Asian. In America, black means Negro, a person of color who speaks with a black Southern accent or an inner-city one. A friend of mine wore a turban and used a phony accent, and he was accepted in lily-white circles in Georgia and Alabama. It can confuse an outsider who hears about this kind of thing, but the white man plays all kinds of mind games on us. In the midst of lynching and brutalizing us, he has still persuaded most of us that U.S. blacks are superior to you King George Negroes or anyone else of color for that matter. The imperialists do that everywhere. First they overwhelm us with their white, male symbols, I concurred, then they play divide and rule games with us. They sell us the idea of a white God, a white Jesus, the West on top, the rest of us below. The white king is dead, long live the white queen. Right now, it's different here, different in many ways from the US. While interracial marriage may be easier and less hazardous here, the job situation is where it was in the US at the beginning of this century. And the way things look at the moment, the British seem hell-bent on moving backwards into the future where race relations are concerned. There was a pause in our conversation until I broke the silence and put into words the questions I had been eager to ask earlier. I keep reading about a new Malcolm X, a transformed El Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, a man whose worldview was drastically changed after a pilgrimage to Mecca. You see, the man who came to Britain 3 months ago and took part in the debate at the Oxford Union and the one facing me right now is the only Malcolm we know. Is this one really a new Malcolm X? No. I'm one and the same person, the son of a mother and father who were devoted Garveyites all of their lives. The son of a father who was murdered and a mother who was mentally crucified by racists. I'm carrying on the work they started, just as my children will carry on my work when I am gone. Before they carted my mother off to a mental hospital and tore our family apart, she kept telling us that without an education we'd be like people. 90. Blindfolded in a forest pockmarked with quicksand. I strayed from those teachings of hers for years, but I came back, didn't I? My vision of the struggle has been broadened, that's true, but my basic commitment is the same. Is racism dead and buried? Can I trust the white American any more than I did before? Are white liberals less treacherous than they were before? But some of your views have changed, I insisted. Shouldn't that be a natural part of everybody's intellectual growing up? He demanded sharply. Take your views on interracial marriage, for example, I continued. I read that you were totally against it, and here I am telling you about my English wife and English stepchildren and you laugh it off. I told you earlier about my great-grand's theory about the mixture of, and you took that in your stride too. All these polyglot bloods, however we came by them, are as much a part of us as our white and red corpuscles, but the only blood relations who would welcome you, accept you as one of their own, are the blacks and the Indians. The others would regard you as an embarrassment they'd rather not face, he said, raising his voice. Then he continued to expound, as though speaking to a large gathering. A month ago, when I was in Canada, I made my views on interracial marriage crystal clear. I said that it was just a matter of one human being marrying another, and it's only the white man's hostility that blows it up into such a big deal. He paused and then continued, your daughter, what's her name again? Lizaveta, but I call her Liza. I named her after the character in Pushkin's Queen of Spades. It's strange, when I took her to the Soviet Union and we were driving across the country, the Russians kept saying that she looked like Pushkin's daughter. But will she grow up to be Negro or English? The shrewd Malcolm asked, because he knew from his mother's experience that balanced in an uneasy equipoise between black and white, if you tried to deny your black blood, there was always a heavy psychological price to pay. If she chooses to be English, she'd have to deny my existence. 91. And that of all of my ancestors, and that denial would haunt her for the rest of her days. Malcolm nodded soberly and looked away for a few seconds. Then, turning back to me, he said, the little bit of walking around London that I've done with you sure was an eye-opener. How do you mean? You're an arrogant Negro, he said with a wide grin. Arrogant? Yes, I noticed the same thing with Tony Abrahams. We come from small places, where we're in the majority. By the time we leave home, we know who we are, and nobody can take away that certainty of knowing. 6. Africa, I have kept your memory. Africa, you are inside me like the splinter in the wound, like the guardian fetish in the center of the village. We proclaim the oneness of the suffering and the revolt of all the peoples on all the face of the earth, and we mix the mortar of the age of brotherhood out of the dust of idols. Jacques Roumain, Boidia being the same heart, the same pulse that beats in the black man on the African continent today is beating in the heart of the black man in North America, Central America, South America, and in the Caribbean. Many of them don't know it, but it's true. Malcolm X, London School of Economics, February 11, 1965. Malcolm was due to speak at the Old Theatre at the London School of Economics in a short while, and he looked 93. 94. Decidedly better as the time drew near. Dermot Hussey had joined us and there were desultory exchanges as Malcolm got ready. I said jokingly, "We'll act as your bodyguards," but he did not respond. As we watched Malcolm getting dressed, it struck me again that, somehow, no one had ever captured what he really looked like. It was easier to match iridescent colors in a kaleidoscope than to capture the real persona of this remarkable man. It would forever elude the bright lights, the television cameras, the swift, incandescent flare of flashbulbs. And as for artists trying to paint portraits of him, the more the artists watched, the less they appeared to have seen. And I thought, they say that not even the most gifted artists of their time could capture a reasonable likeness of Ignatius Loyola on a canvas or in stone. Malcolm X and Loyola, 5 centuries separate them, and how different one is from the other, but they have this in common: no one will ever know what Loyola looked like, and no one who didn't see Malcolm in the flesh will ever know what he really looked like. When we were about to leave the hotel, he said, "It would be better if we didn't leave together." "Of course we'll leave together," Dermot and I protested at the same time. "I can be gunned down at any time," he said with a furrowed brow. We said nothing, but we walked on either side of him across the hotel lobby and into the narrow, bustling street. But at that moment I, too, felt hunted and surrounded by omnipotent and cruel eyes watching our every move and by electronic ears eavesdropping on our every word. In the midst of a sudden bout of paranoia, I was sure Mantop had drawn so close that his breath was almost touching our faces. I glanced sideways at Malcolm, and in the pale light of a winter afternoon he seemed to be taking in everything that was going on around him. I looked straight ahead. The shapes and forms around me, the muted colors and the noise of traffic made me want to flee to the sanctuary of my Wimbledon house. 95. It occurred to me, too, as it had never done before, that I usually went about my business in this city wrapped up in my own thoughts and barely noticing my surroundings. I told myself, anonymity definitely has advantages. Then I wondered, what would it be like to live the rest of my life under the scrutiny of those eyes? Malcolm, I reminded myself, has lived under surveillance so long that he now takes it for granted. Eurocentric history, Du Bois said, is that of the hunter writing about the lion. Well, Malcolm's a Simba who's speaking back, and because of this the white hunters and their black gun carriers, trackers, and houseboys are out to bag him. As we walked toward my car, he said casually, "They warned me that England was cold, and it is." He adjusted his astrakhan hat and buttoned his coat. But I noticed that despite his easy, bantering tone, he trusted no one at that moment, for he knew in his bones that those tracking him down had eyes and ears in every corner of the earth. I thought that we'd become very close, but out there on the cold and impersonal London streets a chasm opened between us. I knew that neither the adulation of thousands nor the devotion of many who were willing to die for him would have been enough to fill the void of loneliness surrounding him. For in the midst of fighting for the dark millions in Africa and the Americas, he was in danger of being transformed into a black version of that Dostoevskian character who loved the human race so much that he could not bear to have another person in a room with him for long. As we settled into my car, I bridged an uncomfortable silence by talking about the weather. When you first come here, the weather torments you, persecutes you, goads you to despair, and dries your dark skin until it looks like an ashen alligator's. But you have to psych yourself up to go outdoors and fight the cold. You tell yourself every morning as you step outside your front door that you have to fight against millions of prejudiced English people plus thousands of West Indian, Pakistani, African, and other Commonwealth middle-class aspirants who have been wearing white masks so long. 96. That they can't take them off. Then you boast to yourself that the sun's in your blood, that you've inherited an invincible heart from ancestors, and that in spite of the darkness that comes in the afternoon, you still keep seeing the bluest skies and the brightest suns in your mind's eye. Toms who wear white masks for so long that they can't show their real faces anymore. He laughed out loud, and the chasm that had opened between us was narrowed by that laughter. I parked on Norfolk Street, and as we walked toward Aldwych and the London School of Economics, I pointed out the West India Committee Building, Fleet Street, the BBC Bush House, the Indian High Commission, and the Theatre District. This whole area is where the past and the present collide. There's the West India Committee where the sugar barons had their headquarters. They made the deals to buy and sell millions of our ancestors, to scatter them across a hemisphere, and often to work them to death on plantations, but they themselves were careful never to touch the money while it was still slippery with our blood. By the time it reached them, it was laundered and perfumed. Tell me more about those students I'm about to face. Folks say they're liberal, but how liberal are they? They're liberal all right, staunchly anti-war and anti-apartheid, but when it comes to doing something concrete about racial discrimination here in Britain, they'll go into an intellectual orbit and you'll need a telescope to locate their position. No matter what kind of radical noises they make at the LSE, they're aspirants to the British ruling class, and with the empire dwindling, they're afraid that fewer and fewer of them will actually make it. Their left-wing posturing is merely a way of being noticed. They're also noted for their irreverence and their ability to rile a speaker with loaded questions. He listened intently and then he said, "There's no crowd that's more irreverent than a Harlem one. If you can get by as a speaker in Harlem, you can make it anywhere." 97. There were reporters waiting to question Malcolm as he, Dermot, and I were greeted by the sponsors of his talk at the main entrance of the London School of Economics. Malcolm parried the questions deftly, smiled, and moved on. A persistent reporter, tagging along behind us, asked, "Mr. X, have you ever been mistaken for a white man in any of the countries you visited?" Malcolm paused, faced him, and replied, "No, sir." Then he added, "A writer, but if you know of such a country, please write and tell me about it. I know many middle-class Negroes who would book passages there right away." A ripple of laughter trailed after him. I had left home in the greyness of the early morning when fog clung to the Wimbledon Common as if it had dug sharp claws into the flesh of the earth. How many hours had I spent with Malcolm? It seemed as if time had been standing still because, by the time we reached the LSE, the grey morning and the grey, somber afternoon looked the same. While we were waiting backstage in the old theatre, I peered through the curtain and reported, "The room's packed. Students are sitting in the aisles. After your triumph at Oxford, you're a hit with these university types. I like the intellectual give and take at universities, but I'll never stop seeing the big picture through the eyes of my folk in Harlem. For, after all my travels, Harlem's my take-off spot on this earth. Nothing will make me forget the suffering of our folk who endured all kinds of punishment for no reason other than that they have black skins. No matter where I go, and no matter if I'm a Muslim, Christian, Hindu, atheist, or agnostic, I'll keep on keeping on in this struggle." He didn't elaborate further, and we said nothing. We knew that he was gearing himself to face an audience once again. I wanted to tell him that at home, we call it beating your own drum and dancing. What happens is that when a virtuoso on the drums is about to face an audience, he does a backstage warm-up. The head of the African Student Society came and told Malcolm that everything was ready for his appearance. He parted the curtain and, amidst loud applause, walked to the podium. 98. From behind the curtain, I could see the white, black, yellow, and various shades of brown faces looking up at him, and adding an exotic touch to the gathering was a sprinkling of turbaned heads like night orchids blooming in the daytime. The murmurs that rose and fell after the applause died down were like waves climbing and retreating up and down a beach at ebb tide. The audience expected an ebony Savonarola, and what they saw instead was a tall, elegant, light-skinned Afro-American with gray-green eyes that appraised them coolly from behind rimless spectacles. What was significant about this and other forums at which Malcolm spoke in Britain and France was that African students were the principal organizers. Everywhere that he had gone in Africa, young people had come in the hundreds to hear him speak, and the news about his bold and stirring call for a transatlantic black unity had, very quickly, reached the African students abroad. Then, of course, there were both black and white students who were anxious to see the man whom the news media had transformed into a demon celebrity. "Malcolm's a man living life in a hurry," Dermot commented hoarsely. "He's like a comet burning himself out to light up our black world." Ossie Davis, that splendid black actor, when asked by a white editor after Malcolm's death why he admired Malcolm, explained, "Malcolm kept snatching our lies away. He kept shouting the painful truth we whites and blacks did not want to hear from all the housetops. And he wouldn't stop for love or money." Ted Jones, the African-American jazz poet, captured the essence of what Malcolm was in his most fiery days when he wrote, "Malcolm screamed at them but bespoke softly to me. Malcolm stripped T-bum naked but he clothed me." Yet privately, Malcolm, even at the height of his white devil period, was the epitome of courtly manners, of charm, and an 99 innate graciousness. His parents had taught him those good manners when he was a child, and when he became a Muslim minister those teachings reasserted themselves. Sitting in the packed room at the London School of Economics and waiting reverently for Malcolm to appear was Michael de Freitas. He would later call himself Michael X and claim that he had been chosen by Malcolm X to be his leading apostle in Britain. The only thing that Michael had in common with Malcolm, however, was that they had both begun as outlaws in their respective societies, but here the comparison has to end abruptly. For once Malcolm became a Muslim and dedicated his life to the cause of black liberation, his personal life was austere, ascetic, and morally irreproachable. Besides, Malcolm, during and after serving time in prison, had a passion for books and ideas. Michael, in contrast, remained a creature of instinct, and listening to his anti-racist pronouncements, even when they were, at times, right on target, one was left with an uneasy feeling as a certain obscurantism crept into the rest of what he had to say. As for his claim to being a Muslim convert, he in fact never abided by any of the austere tenets that the Quran prescribes. Instead, he proclaimed himself to be the leader of a movement that eventually turned out to be more shadow than substance. He was, however, not without ability, charm, intelligence, and a West Indian sense of loyalty to his friends. In fact, he became a leader by default, for in the absence of militant, fearless, eloquent, and incorruptible grassroots leaders like Malcolm X, and without a movement like Elijah Muhammad's Black Muslims, Michael X did help to dramatize the plight of immigrants of color in Britain and to prod a reluctant British government into taking half-hearted steps to deal with racial discrimination. Michael X, with his dark prophet's beard highlighting a sallow complexion, looked like one of those millenarian prophet priests that oppressed black societies occasionally throw up Bookman and Macundal in Haiti, Bedward in Jamaica, Jordan in Guyana, Arpika the Black/Seminole shaman in Florida, and others. What Malcolm X and his transatlantic imitator Michael X had in 100 common was an inner rage against white oppression. And this rage, burning like a flame in secret chambers of their hearts, lent a mysterious aura of reined-in power to their personalities. Michael X, enthralled by every word that Malcolm uttered at that LSE meeting, told me afterward that he had decided there and then to set up a black nationalist movement in Britain. Malcolm began to speak after an introductory encomium in which he was described as a Joshua, a redeemer, and the most eloquent spokesman for oppressed black people since Marcus Garvey. The heightened murmur of voices that greeted his appearance subsided, and he seemed to grow taller under the harsh lights. No one could have guessed that earlier in the day he'd been afflicted with flu and that stomach cramps and chills had left him looking crumpled and wretched. With the exception of a handful of us, most of those present were seeing Malcolm in the flesh for the first time. Supporters, detractors, and the curious had come to see a black messianic nemesis figure whom a hostile media had created. To their surprise, what they saw instead was a smiling, supremely confident humanitarian who greeted them graciously and accorded them a respect that their professors seldom did, and this immediately erased the distorted media images from their minds. He thanked the Africa Society for inviting him and said that he had been told that students at the LSE were smart, enlightened, and noted for giving controversial speakers like himself a hard time. "I look forward to the verbal contests that will ensue after I speak," he assured them. He seemed to be speaking off the cuff as he continued, but his talk was, in fact, structured and balanced, and the wide range of themes he touched on were all interrelated. Malcolm carried the American racial situation with him wherever he went. He saw the world through a spectrum of America's inner cities. His world was one shaped by his experiences in those inner cities, particularly in Harlem. It was in Harlem that he found the extended family that had been denied him when he was growing up. It was there that he was given the love and understanding that he had needed so desperately during the turbulent, formative decades after his father's tragic death. The women in 101. Harlem, Black and West Indian alike, became collective surrogate mothers, and it was through them that he could once again acknowledge Louise, the mother he had shut out of his life. Whether he was in Cairo, London, Paris, Accra, Nairobi, or Dar es Salaam, he was always speaking to the world from a platform in Harlem. The opening themes he touched on in his talk at the LSE were loaded with coded messages to his grassroots constituents in America's inner cities. The media had noised it everywhere that he had changed, that after his pilgrimage to Mecca he no longer denounced whites as devils, that he had abandoned Elijah Muhammad's Manichaean doctrines. The underlying suggestion in these rumors was that somehow he had sold out and betrayed his gullible followers. The grassroots folk were accustomed to hot gospelers of black revolution assailing the citadels of white, male power with incendiary words and then, in a thrice, being co-opted, neutralized, silenced, or killed. But they trusted Malcolm above all others. He had an inner ear for their resentments, hopes, and longings for a better life, and for a world free from the racial contempt that had been foisted on the backs of slave ancestors and then on theirs. He was more in tune with the secret rhythms of their lives than any black leader had been since Marcus Garvey. So speaking to that sophisticated audience at the LSE, he was also sending messages to calm the fears and apprehensions of his inner-city devotees. He knew and they knew that the media would automatically misconstrue his words, quote him out of context, and attribute the basest of motives to his deeds, but they were skilled at reading between the lines, ignoring the sly, racist innuendos, and drawing their own conclusions. The enthralled listeners at the LSE did not realize that Malcolm was at once speaking to them and to a transatlantic audience. He explained that he was now an Orthodox Muslim and that his religion taught brotherhood. He no longer judged people by the color of their skin, but, he added, "I have to be a realist. I live in America, a society which does not believe in brotherhood in any sense of the term. It is a racist society ruled by segregationists." 102. This harsh and unequivocal statement was addressed to his followers back home. He was reassuring them that so long as their condition remained as it was, he would continue to spell out the truth about it with his down-to-earth metaphors and his trumpet calls for resistance. "We are not for violence in any shape or form, but believe that the people who have violence committed against them should be able to defend themselves." This was a point he emphasized in every one of his major public speeches, but here at the LSE, he elaborated on it. "I have never said that Negroes should initiate acts of aggression against whites, but when the government fails to protect the Negro he is entitled to do it himself." While sending coded messages home, he was also warning the new immigrants of color in Britain that in white-dominated societies, they should never rely entirely on laws and statutes for their protection from racism, that when the agencies of the state are run by racists, then laws will inevitably be perverted, that being vigilant and organizing to defend the rights of individuals, families, and communities is absolutely essential. "Don't wait until they're getting ready to send you to the ovens," he warned again and again. In the midst of issuing dire warnings and telling harsh, unvarnished truths, however, he made this predominantly white audience at the LSE feel at ease. His body language, his charisma, his utter sincerity, and the glittering intelligence this handsome and elegantly turned out man projected was such that no one in that audience could possibly have felt threatened. He was at times acerbic, and occasionally his wit flashed like a mirror twisted in the sunlight. At one point, when he was noting a glaring contradiction in U.S. foreign policy, he declared, "I come from a country that is busily sending the Peace Corps to Nigeria while sending hired killers to the Congo." He then suggested that his African brothers and sisters should take another look and see the Peace Corps for what it really is. "What is it?" a voice from the audience asked, and with the barest of pauses, Malcolm replied with a broad smile, "Exactly what it says, Peace Corps, get a piece of your country." 103. This kind of swift, perfectly timed, and biting repartee struck a responsive chord in the audience. It was very much in line with the British debating tradition, and laughter and cheers interrupted Malcolm's speech for a moment. From this point onward, it was clear that Malcolm had won over most of the audience. Dermot and I stood at opposite ends of the stage. Malcolm's back was turned to us. He held himself erect and stood on one spot throughout his speech. Occasionally we saw his face in profile with its changing expressions, from wide-mouthed laughter to an earnestness that was so intense he reminded me of a black leopard about to spring. His eyes, too, never left the audience, searching the faces before him. He was one of those rare speakers who always gave his best to his listeners, and through his discourse he took them into his confidence. He was at different times a teacher, a storyteller, and a griot. He could use words to distill the collective griefs of black people and transform them into hard, crystalline calls for action. His was an eloquent exercise in Aristotle's catharsis and purging of the spirit as he shifted the collective mood deftly from the somber to the amused and from the indignant to the sad and the triumphant. When he talked about the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, 2 white, 1 black, there was a note of subdued anger in his voice, and his eyes glittered like diamonds. At that moment, it once again struck me forcibly that he was willing to die for beliefs and that, like Patrice Lumumba, he would face his killers calmly, unflinchingly, and defy them with his last breath. When they found the bodies, he declared, they said that every bone in the body of the black one was broken. It was as if those brutes had gone insane while they were beating him to death. His bald, detailed account of the murder of 3 civil rights workers and the bombing of a church that resulted in the death of 4 children brought tears to some eyes while others flashed with anger and shame. Then, raising strong and elegant hands like shields on either side of his face, he declared, 104. It is the African Revolution that produced the Black Muslim movement. It is the Black Muslim movement that pushed the civil rights movement, that pushed the liberals out into the open, a people who have no more concern for the rights of dark-skinned humanity than they do for any other form of humanity. I wondered whether Malcolm had seen the tears and the anger in the eyes fixed on him, white tears and black tears, white anger and black anger for transatlantic victims of racist violence. Threading its way through that brilliant speech was a pristine belief in the African Revolution. This was a declaration of faith by someone who would not live long enough to see the twists and turns that revolution would take, or the brutal and savage low-intensity warfare unleashed against whole societies that were trying to free themselves from the imperialist yoke. Toward the end of his speech, Malcolm the visionary moved away from parochial moorings into the open seas of world revolution. The black man in the Western Hemisphere, he declared, and especially in the United States, is beginning to see where his problem is not one of civil rights, but it is rather one of human rights. Once this problem is brought onto the world stage, then we can join forces with brothers and sisters in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, and those people in Europe who would join us to see that our rights are guaranteed, because, he concluded, and his voice was charged with a passionate conviction, the oppressed masses of people all over the world are crying out for action against the common oppressor. In that last part of his speech, Malcolm gave the clearest indication of how he had changed and, Consequently, how his worldview had changed. Talking about the new revolutionary role the black man in the Western Hemisphere was being called on to play, he was in fact confessing that he'd come a long way from the simplistic racial nostrums of his earlier black Muslim period. He was also outlining the new direction his organization of Afro-American unity would be taking. And implicit in this declaration, 105, was the combination of Agarvate nationalism and the Pan-Africanism of Kwame Nkrumah, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmar, and C.L.R. James and others. He was, in short, affirming, as they had done before him, that when Africa is free and united, then black people everywhere will be treated with respect. Malcolm was appealing directly to the finest instincts of the overwhelming majority of young people in the audience. He was calling on black people everywhere to unite and stand shoulder to shoulder with Asians, Latin Americans, and those people in Europe, some of whom claim to mean right, do whatever is necessary to that our rights are guaranteed us not sometime in the long future, but almost immediately. These bold statements indicated that he was in the midst of formulating new political, social, religious, and economic theories. The ones that had served him well when he was transforming Elijah Muhammad's obscure, millenarian movement into a nationwide one that was alarming the white power structure were no longer valid. The theory that black people should own the small businesses in their neighborhoods was central to the economic philosophy of black nationalism. It is, of course, a perfectly valid theory. But the theory caged itself in the ghettos and suggested that in a capitalist system one could have capitalist communes that could exist largely unto themselves. It became more theology and wish fulfillment than economic fact. Malcolm had pointed out that when the people of the inner cities could not have face-to-face confrontations with absentee owners of businesses in their neighborhoods, they would attack their property instead, that when those folks were accused of rioting and destroying their own neighborhoods, this was false, since the majority were tenants and itinerants in the inner cities who owned little besides the clothes on their backs. But those invisible agents of exploitation, the absentee landlords, were actually piggybacking on the bigger capitalists such as the real estate conglomerates, the food industry, the banks, and so on. These were the most formidable predators in the capitalist free market forests, but their invisibility was more absolute than 106 ghosts I/01 are blood that of those riding on their backs. They were screened from the gaze of have-nots in the ghetto by towering battlements of class, race, gender, and an elaborate state apparatus. While he was abroad, Malcolm could see the whole network of exploitation and not just its strands in the ghettos. His meetings with heads of state and his long conversations with them had helped him to see the visceral connections among imperialism, colonialism, and racism. He also saw clearly that religion, be it Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or any other, could be used either to anesthetize the minds of believers or to awaken them to a consciousness of their power to make the world a better place for everyone. Malcolm occasionally relieved the intensity with which he expressed his ideas by a very telling and witty remark. After damning Martin Luther King, Jr., with faint praise, for example, he declared that whites should be grateful for the way in which his nonviolent preachings had been able to hold a restive black population in check. However, he cautioned, although there were those who wanted to believe differently, King was in fact losing control of a potentially explosive situation. "That is why you're in trouble," he said, smiling broadly. "You want someone to come and tell you that your house is safe, while you're sitting on a powder keg." The laughter that greeted the statement was both friendly and spontaneous. I kept thinking as I watched those eager faces in the audience, here's Malcolm giving the white imperialists and racists hell, and yet this predominantly white audience is simply lapping it up. 3 months earlier, when Malcolm had taken part in the Oxford Union debate, the same thing had happened. From my vantage point, I could see a middle-aged black man sitting in the back row. He had a child in his arms, and the child was fast asleep. I said to myself, I wonder if he's some kind of informer because the sleeping child could be sedated and would provide him with a perfect cover. He isn't taking notes, but he could have a recorder on his person or the child's. The bloke might even be some kind of assassin. Jesus Christ, Jan, don't be bloody paranoid. I kept looking at the man's brown and grizzled face every now and then, but it told me nothing. He was listening. 107. Intently. When others in the audience laughed, the child stirred in its sleep, but the man's face remained mask-like and imperturbable. The laughter, though, made Malcolm pause and wait until it subsided before he continued. At the end of the formal question period, Malcolm mingled with the crowd, shook hands, and answered questions, giving his full attention to every individual to whom he spoke. Michael de Freitas had vanished, and so had the man with the sleeping child. Dermot, with his eyes fixed on Malcolm as he conversed with this or that individual, said, if the brother had asked those white students to join him at the barricades, the majority of them would have done so. They'd have joined him immediately after he'd spoken, I said, but after they had time to think things over, he'd be manning the barricades alone. Still, one or two people in that crowd will always remember what he said, and it might change their lives. And then, perhaps, they'll change the lives of others. On the way to his next appointment, the flu reasserted itself and Malcolm slumped down in the back seat of the car. I was trying to detect who the British and American agents were in the crowd, I said, and he perked up. Did you notice the man with the child in his arms? I asked. Yes, I spotted him, Malcolm said. He wasn't an agent, but there was a white guy sitting a few rows from the back. I recognized him. He follows me around everywhere. A secret agent who isn't so secret, Dermot commented. They try to intimidate me, Malcolm said, straightening himself and laughing. He's pumping up the adrenaline for his next meeting, I told myself, looking at him in the rearview mirror. Jesus Lord, the chap's amazing. Somehow, at that moment I remembered the simple inscription on Henry Christoph's tomb, I will rise again from my ashes. And I thought, the only way they'll be able to prevent Malcolm from rising again from his ashes would be to let him live and discredit himself. If they kill him, he's sure to rise from his ashes again and again. 7 I was afraid of life and asked myself, what will it be like when I'm grown up? Rigoberta Menchie I/have forgotten the idle words that people said, but treasure the day when iron doors swung wide and I slipped into the heartland of my people. Juanita Bell. The biographers of Malcolm X, and their numbers are increasing every year, have never portrayed his Grenadine mother, Louise Langdon Norton Little, as the remarkable woman that she was. She is, instead, invariably depicted as a distraught, tragic figure who after her husband's murder succumbed to madness and was committed to a mental hospital. From then onward, she disappears from the pages of history. When Louise Little is mentioned in the biographies of her famous son, her life story is more notable for its omissions than for what is actually told about her. Alex Haley's portrayal in his autobiography of Malcolm X is more sympathetic than all of the others. Nevertheless, even Haley leaves an erroneous impression of Louise. The persistently maligned, brainless and hot-blooded. 109. 110. Female of color is one of those sexist clichés that dies hard even in the minds of its victims. Rufina Winter, a professor at Stanford University, once confessed that the first time she saw a true literary image of herself as a West Indian woman of mixed blood was when she read Edgar Mittelhalzer's novel The Life and Death of Sylvia. Before the rewarding discovery of the Sylvia in that sensitively wrought and illuminating novel, she said, she had invariably seen women of color as unintelligent, oversexed, and exotic creatures breathlessly waiting to be used and rejected by white heroes. Literature, films, and television have provided us with an infinite number of distorted images of the fictitious and dehumanized mulatto female. This was part of a rationale used to justify slavery and its monstrous cruelties. Frederick Douglass, in his brilliant and moving autobiography, left us an unforgettable record of how mulattoes, both male and female, had to face a special brand of malice, spite, hatred, and exploitation in the American South. The offspring of white plantation owners and slave women, he said, were almost invariably treated more harshly than their unmixed African kin. He himself, he attested, grew up knowing that his father was the owner of the plantation on which he worked as a slave. The white wives of the planters, in particular, he said, vented a special kind of jealous wrath upon the mulatto offspring of their husbands. Their husbands' infidelities stamped painful and ineradicable resemblances on the features, mannerisms, and the very aura of those mulatto slaves. When Fidel Castro declared at a rally in Havana, "Even when we look white, we are all mulattoes," he was, for the first time, publicly acknowledging that there were ghosts of dark ancestors in the blood of millions in this hemisphere and that this was a legacy of slavery, exploitation, and the usurpation of Native American land. He was also affirming that we must make this a source of strength, since these are there to remind us constantly that our liberation struggle is a complex one in which historical conflicts of race, class, caste, color, and culture determine both how we see ourselves and how others see us. The notes I had taken about Louise Little during my chance. 111. Encounter with the Grenadine matriarch Tanta Bess and my conversations with Malcolm X in London would have continued to languish in my files if I had not taken part in a television show on the crisis of black education in Washington, D.C., in 1990. Paul Lee, a young, indefatigable, and able research scholar, saw the TV show in Detroit and contacted me through the producer. Paul, as I was soon to discover, is one of those rare self-educated individuals whom one occasionally runs into in black communities. After dropping out of college, he devoted his life and personal resources to collecting invaluable material on Malcolm X and his worldwide role in the black liberation struggle. I was a visiting Robinson Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Literature and History at George Mason University when Paul phoned me. A few weeks after our conversation, he visited me in Fairfax, Virginia, and presented me with photocopied pictures of Malcolm X and me at the Commonwealth Institute reception in London. Shortly afterward, with the idea of writing a book on Malcolm X slowly crystallizing in my mind, I was Paul's guest in Detroit for a few days. During that visit I was amazed and profoundly impressed both by the content of the material he had amassed and by the way he had carefully arranged and meticulously classified the priceless documents. Seeing the array of research material in his study, a trained librarian, archivist, or research scholar would have been envious. Through Paul, I met Wilfred Little, Malcolm's eldest brother. Wilfred, I learned afterward, not only was one of Paul's mentors, he was also the mentor to several generations of black youth in Detroit. He was in his early 70s when I met him in 1990, tall, powerfully built, with the large head and bold features of a heraldic figure in Moorish Spain. His manner of sitting perfectly still with his large hands in repose when he spoke stood out in stark contrast to the restless Malcolm I remembered. Malcolm could never sit still for long, and his eloquent hands constantly responded and moved in perfect harmony with the cadences of his voice. Wilfred was also much darker than Malcolm. "I took after my father," he told me. "I have his color and his physique." He was 112 ghosts I/OIR blood, the strongest man I ever knew, though, and even in my prime I was never as strong as he was. My first serious conversations with Wilfred began when I was a guest in his house in 1991. They continued later in the year when he visited me in Bloomington, Illinois. Before launching into reminiscences about his mother, Wilfred said, "We're living in a world of illusions. When I talk to people, I tell them that all the time. I warn them, hey, look, this is a world of illusions, it's a great, big phony world. What you think you see is not really what you see." They teach a lot of idealism to students in the best schools, but when they get out into the real world, they find that it's a whole different way that things are run out there, that there's a whole lot of lying, deceiving, cheating, and murder out there. My mother knew it, and Malcolm knew it. But I'm proud of my family, and proud that my parents in their modest way made us grow up with a self-identity and with pride in what we were. Malcolm continued the work that my father and mother started. He took their Marcus Garvey philosophy a step further. In his quiet avuncular fashion, Wilfred began telling an entirely different story of his mother's life from the one that the biographers of Malcolm X had so far penned. The story of her life was an epic one, he declared proudly. The epic began in Grenada, continued in Canada, and ended here in the States. In all three countries there are parts of her life waiting to be resurrected. She was a small-boned and slender woman, 5 feet 8 inches tall, and she carried herself well. Because she always held herself erect, she looked taller, but beside my 6'4" father she looked short. She was also fair-skinned and had a full head of hair. Her feet, though, were narrow, and she had a time finding shoes. Yes, she carried herself well, and the springs didn't go out of her legs until she was past 80. And talking about feet, I remember Malcolm's feet and the way he used to walk. With his tall self, he had what I called a tiger boy walk. He sure had his own special way of walking. You could tell from a distance that it was Malcolm. But my mother didn't simply disappear into a world of 113 madness after my father's death, so let me try and fill in some of the missing pieces for you. When my father died on September 28, 1931, we were living in an unfinished house. My father was a master builder. He could do everything: the foundation work, the plumbing, the roofing, the plastering, and he could put all the finishing touches to a house so that it looked real nice. He literally built our home with his own 2 hands. He had to build it one section at a time. Because of his Garvate beliefs, nobody would give him a regular job. The whites said that he was uppity, and there were a lot of frightened Negroes who grumbled that he and my mother were rocking the boat. But he was a resourceful man and she was a resourceful woman. He'd leave home early and walk the roads, going from farm to farm and offering to do whatever repairs the farm buildings needed, and he could point out to the farmers where repairs were needed, so those white farmers would allow him to do that kind of odd job work for them. He was good at it, and they had a respect for his skill as a worker. But let me back up a bit. We plowed and planted crops on our own land and raised most of our own food, so before he left home in the mornings, my father would take us outside and show us what he wanted us to do, like getting the weeds up from between the rows. So before he went on his rounds, each one of us had a job to do, and my mother would see to it that we did it before he came back home in the evening. And if they both had to go out, the oldest child, that's me, would be in charge. Malcolm was always the most rebellious of us. As he got older and became more independent, he'd find some excuse to go back to the house for something, and we wouldn't see him again. He'd go and get with his friends in the city. When my father returned home in the evening, depending on the season, he'd plow and plant and weed and harvest. Then, bit by bit, he'd make additions to the house. Physically, he was one of the strongest men I ever knew. My mother, too, worked all day and well into the night. She made dresses and crocheted gloves for mostly white women. If my father had continued to live, no telling what we would have turned out to be, because we were a very tight family. We worked together, and our parents always had us working towards some useful goal. But my father's death had a devastating effect on our tight family unit. We were living in Lansing at the time, and I'll always remember the night he was almost cut in half on the streetcar line. He had come home after a long day's work and was just about to settle down for the night when he announced that he was going back into town to get something he had forgotten. "Don't go, early," my mother pleaded with him. "I have a strange feeling that something bad could happen to you out there tonight." She had a way of foretelling events, and I don't remember her ever being wrong. But my father had made up his mind. He put on his jacket and left, saying that he'd be back soon. She ran after him, calling out, "Don't go, early. Come back, early." I can't remember ever seeing her like that before. Anyway, I stayed with her as usual while she did her chores, and a couple of hours later we heard a noise as if someone opened the front door, entered, and walked upstairs. "Did you hear your father come in and go upstairs?" my mother asked. "Yes, I heard as if someone come in," I said, but when she went upstairs and checked, he wasn't there. It wasn't too long after that that a state trooper came to the door and told my mother that she should come to the hospital right away because my father had been seriously injured in an accident. So, all of a sudden, my mother was on her own with all those children and no help from anywhere. Other black people who lived in the city looked upon us as being odd because we were always going against the stream and our parents were always challenging things that they didn't think were right. My father was always out there trying to encourage our people to get together and do something to improve their lives, but they felt that he and my mother were rocking the boat and that she, in particular, didn't think the way they did. She didn't like the idea of charity, but all of a sudden she had no husband, and there was no way with all those children but to accept charity. The house was unfinished, the insurance company was saying that my father's death was a 115 suicide, and the ones who controlled the welfare system were giving her a hard time, putting undue pressures on her. They wanted her to sell the house, but she refused. A few of my mother's West Indian friends did try to help out, but the odds against her were increasing. She was a very good seamstress. She made all of our clothes, and then, like I said before, she sewed for mostly white customers. There were very few black ones. I remember that when we lived in Milwaukee, we had a little store and a storefront, with an apartment next door. She used the store to sell her merchandise. Back in those days, the boys wore a jacket and knickers to match, and the girls wore dresses with bloomers that came below the dresses. She was brave, and she was a fighter. She worked harder at her dressmaking after she was widowed. Young as I was then, I could see that she was tired and trying to take on too much. I went to school in the daytime and worked in a general store in the evening to make extra money and help pay the bills and things, and my mother would say, "I don't know what I would do if it wasn't for Wilfred. He doesn't act like a child anymore. He just takes on responsibility like a man." But what happened was this: there was a phony probate judge who was more or less in charge, and he put a lot of pressure on my mother. He wanted to buy the property and leaned on her to sell. He'd tell her that she couldn't stay on welfare and own that property, which was untrue. He arranged it so that her monthly check as a widow would come through him, and every time she went to collect it he would put more pressure on her to sell the property. When she realized what he was doing, she started sending me to collect the check. But this judge's secretary, and I can't remember his name or hers, would keep telling me that he wasn't in. So my mother sent me back and said, "When she tells you he isn't in, just say that I told you to wait." So I went back and waited, and other people kept going into his office, so after a while he came out and handed me the check. Now, he and other officials began increasing the pressure on her and saying that she needed to go into an institution. I took her to a psychiatrist myself. He was white, and I can't remember his name either. I asked him to 116 go psy/01R blood examine my mother and tell me what was going on. He made an appointment to see her on a Saturday, and I took her to him, and he spent some time with her, and the next day he came and said, "She needs proper rest and nutrition. If there's someone who could take over her responsibilities for a while so that she could get the proper nutrition and not be responsible for anyone, she'd be all right in a little while." But there wasn't anyone. Perhaps because, even now, telling the story of his mother's journey in and out of a psychological Gethsemane is still too painful, Wilfred left out details about the symptoms of her imminent nervous breakdown, which he certainly must have witnessed. Why else would he have accompanied her to a psychiatrist? His mother's inexplicable withdrawal into a safe, private world of fantasies and dreams and the changes in her behavior must have bewildered and traumatized not only Wilfred, but also Malcolm and the other little siblings. The anguish this engendered would have been exacerbated in their young minds when their mother was summarily committed to a mental hospital, while they were consigned to different foster homes. After surviving 25 years of forced confinement, Louise Little was rescued by Wilfred, Malcolm, and other family members. She went to live with her daughter Yvonne in a small country town named Woodland in Upper Michigan. She died there in 1991 at age 91. So she survived Malcolm by 26 years, and during that period she enjoyed a normal and peaceful existence, but nobody seems to take that into account when writing about her life, Wilfred explained. In 1993, after visiting Grenada for the first time, he said, "Perhaps someday her remains can finally be laid to rest at La Diga, where she was born and where she grew up." As my conversations with Wilfred continued, images of Louise Little as a tragic, victimized female faded and bold new ones portrayed her as a complex, heroic, strong-willed, and intelligent Grenadian woman who, despite all of the tragedies that had befallen her, played a vital role in shaping the character of her children. During the years between childhood and early youth, Wilfred said, "My mother and father, who were both staunch 117 Garveyites, handed to all of their children a sense of racial pride. She had a better formal education than my father did, but they both had a respect for learning. She told me that she'd attended an Anglican school in Grenada and that the teachers believed that sparing the rod spoiled the child. So she passed on to us some of the strictness from her own upbringing, just like my father did from his. They had to teach us how to survive in a hostile white world, and now I can understand why they had to be strict. But in addition to drilling her in the 3 R's as if her life depended on it, my mother's Grenadian teachers taught her to recite poetry and helped her develop a love for words. My mother constantly dinned into our heads that a good education offered the best chance for us to make something worthwhile of our lives." Wilfred could sit as still as a Native American shaman, and I thought, he never gestures with his hands the way Malcolm did. How different the two are. Even after a short time in his presence, you can see how all his life he has had to be cautious, disciplined, dedicated, and absolutely responsible. He reminded me of a wise old elephant who always tests bridges before crossing them. There was a chuckle in his voice when he continued. "Every day when we came home from school, my mother would sit us down and have us read aloud passages from Marichaud's paper The West Indian. Marichaud was her countryman and somebody she boasted about all the time. He and Garvey were her 2 idols. Marichaud, a black Grenadian, could write the English language with more polish and, at the same time, tell you more about the world's situation than all those white reporters writing in the Detroit papers put together. Anyway, when we were doing our homework, there was always a dictionary on the table, and when we mispronounced a word my mother made us look it up and learn both to spell and to pronounce it correctly. By reading that Marichaud paper day after day, we developed reading and writing skills superior to those of our white classmates. By reading Garvey's paper and Marichaud's paper, we got an education in international affairs and learned what black people were doing for their own betterment all over the world." 118. Wilfred then mentioned quite casually that Garvey had visited their home on several occasions and that his mother had told him that one of the aides who accompanied him was a cousin of hers. "I remember this aide of Garvey's accompanying him wherever he went, and I'm sure, from the way he looked, that he must have had some East Indian blood in him," Wilfred said. "But I can never forget that when Marcus Garvey was on the run from the FBI, my mother hid him in our house and wrote letters and dispatches for him. She was an educated woman who could write clearly and well, and several times, she received letters from the leaders of the movement thanking her for the work she had done and praising her for her devotion to the cause." Wilfred recalled that regardless of how onerous and demanding his mother's daily chores were, and they were indeed daunting, she always found time to supervise their homework. After her husband was murdered by the Klan, however, for a while she became stricter than ever. As a widow with 8 mouths to feed, Wilfred began, and then, without finishing the sentence, he declared, keeping the family together was always uppermost in her mind. As things got worse, this became an obsession. Once again, he did not continue, but I had heard enough. The picture he had drawn of his mother had already brought her to life for me. The burst of strictness was part of a desperate bid to teach last-minute lessons in survival to her children before a concatenation of pressures overwhelmed her. Wilfred then emphasized a point that the biographers of Malcolm have ignored: although the family was broken up, my mother's early teaching stayed with us. I always remember that she didn't like to live in the city, and my father didn't like it either. Whenever we lived in a big city, during the summer, once school was out, my father would always take us to the country. We would stay on farms with friends, sometimes spending a month or so there. They wanted us to be exposed to country life and to get to know about nature. My mother liked to take us out into the woods and show us different herbs and tell us what they could cure. She'd teach us things about nature that we would never learn about. 119. In the city. This helped me have a better understanding of the world I lived in. Another thing, when we were living in Wisconsin, she was always a welcome guest on a nearby Indian reservation. The Indians treated her like one of their own, and she'd sit with them and join them in singing their chants. I know that she spent time with the Caribs in Grenada, so this was just connecting her to an experience from her past. As I spoke to Wilfred, it became increasingly clear that the story of his mother's life in Grenada, despite all of its intriguing omissions, had, with advancing years, loomed larger and larger in his imagination. This was only natural, since, as the eldest in the family, he had been her principal confidant after her husband's death. After his visit to Grenada in 1993, Wilfred confessed that the journey to his mother's homeland had been one of the most important and rewarding in his life. That visit, he said, helped him to gather fragments from stories of her early life that she had told him over the years and to piece them together as he had never been able to do before. One of the highlights of his visit was when his Grenadian hosts took him to the spot on which his great-grandmother's house had once stood. All traces of what had once been the family home for 3 generations, however, were erased by time, neglect, hurricanes, and successive growth of tropical vegetation, and yet it was in that vanished house that his mother was born, and it was there that she had grown up. Apart from stating the bald facts about that historic visit, Wilfred told me nothing about how he felt while looking at that vacant, overgrown plot of land. A few months later, however, he confessed that he would like to have his mother's ashes returned to Grenada and buried on that spot, so that although the house was no longer there, the memory of this place where she had lived and played and dreamed her first dreams would be kept alive. For Malcolm, her world-renowned 4th son, was the inheritor of those dreams, and he had immortalized them with his enchanted tongue and his legendary courage. Making that spot a hallowed one would also complete the transatlantic. 120. Ellipsis, inside of which Malcolm, his redoubtable father, and his fearless mother had taken part in an epic struggle for human rights and human dignity. When he returned from Grenada, Wilfred commented with a chuckle that although he already knew that Malcolm was greatly admired abroad, the extent of this admiration nevertheless had astonished him. He had also become more conscious of the negative side of the adulation that his famous brother enjoyed at home and abroad, since there seemed to be more and more detractors and idolaters alike, claiming that they were blood relatives or friends of friends supposedly privy to the most intimate secrets of the little family. With a slow smile and a deprecating wave of the hand, Wilfred said, "From time to time, folk in Lansing will call and tell me that some kind of critter is running around town asking a lot of questions about our family. I remember that a few years ago, there was one, in particular, who they said was writing a book, and all he wanted to hear was something derogatory. If they told him something good, he didn't want to hear it. Well, when you omit our good deeds and brave deeds and positive achievements, we become accustomed to seeing ourselves as being powerless and without any real human identity, so if by running down someone like Malcolm, some little person can strut and shine for a moment, there's always room for him or her to jump at the chance to do this, and this applies to folks in Grenada just like it does to folks here." An American biographer of Malcolm X, who was obviously unaware of the complexity of social customs in West Indian society, wrote somewhat prissily that Louise's mother had had 3 children out of wedlock. The implication was that this showed a terrible flaw in her character. Although Louise was definitely not the child of common-law parents, it should have been pointed out that the term out of wedlock is largely meaningless unless one is talking about the elites or the respectable lower middle class in West Indian society. The majority of West Indians do not regard illegitimacy as something to be excoriated. The fact is that a significant percentage of West Indian children born out of wedlock are the offspring of parents living Jan Karen 21 in stable common law family units. Governments in the English-speaking Caribbean, therefore, have been forced to change the laws of inheritance to deal more fairly and compassionately with this all-pervasive reality. In local Grenadine parlance, it is said of couples living in common law unions that they're married but not churched. Since Catholicism is the main religion of the island and the priests declare that all unions between men and women must be sanctified by marriage, Grenadines strike a compromise with the Almighty by constantly affirming that at some time in the distant future they intend to have their marriage churched. A working-class Grenadine will describe his or her common-law partner as my intended. Louise Langdon's white father, however, in his blatant exploitation of her Creole mother, was merely exercising his semi-feudal droit de seigneur, the right of the bushes, the buckras, the scions of the planter class to use women for their carnal satisfaction and then to discard them. In Louise's time, too, the bushes in Grenada were not only white, they also had brown or black imitators. Where the darker-skinned bushes were concerned, their status as professionals, high-ranking civil servants, landowners, or businessmen could whiten them. Because emigration from Grenada had been a necessity in the past and remains so to this day, both close and distant relatives in Louise's extended family are now scattered across 3 continents. The stories of her growing up in rural Grenada are, therefore, fragmented and dispersed across the Caribbean and in Latin America, Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. All of those who knew her as a child growing up in La Diga, however, are now dead, and memory plays strange tricks when it is filtered from one generation to the next. But the oral tradition is still alive in Grenada, and a fortunate but purely accidental meeting in Bacolod with a venerable matriarch confirmed this. She had introduced herself by saying, "I am Mistress Bessie Romaine from La Diga, but everyone calls me Tanta Bess, and that's what you can call me, young man." It is the custom in rural Grenada that when people introduce themselves, they tell you their name and the place where 122 ghosts I/01 are blood they were born, because their umbilical cord is buried in that particular village, hamlet, or town, bonding them there to a sacred spot on earth for life. La Diga? Isn't that where Malcolm X's mother grew up? I asked. That's where Louise Langdon was born, she confirmed. I already knew that she and Louise had grown up together. Someone had told me so, and that was why I had asked a friend to take me to her house in the hills. Once I had befriended her and allayed her suspicions, she began to talk to me freely about Louise and her family. I must confess, though, that talking to a number of other folk, I often recalled Oscar Wilde's quip about the Irish, and I couldn't help concluding with the same perceptive cynicism of that Irish wit that Grenadines too are a very honest people, they never speak well of one another. In 1979, when I lived in Grenada, there were still older folk who could talk about Louise and her Langdon, Orgias, Norton, and other relatives as if she had only left the island recently. At that time, however, Louise had already migrated, first to Canada and then to the United States, over half a century ago. But in the oral tradition, time is compressed so that past happenings, embroidered with gossip, imaginative speculation, and a sprinkling of truths, can be highlighted and dramatized. Tanta Bess told her tales with a sense of conviction and an unusual memory for significant details that left no doubt about the authenticity of her recollections. She always sat in a rocking chair in a room dappled with sunlight and shadows, and she brought the past back to life more vividly than photograph albums, notes, and diaries could have done for me. As she spoke, a great-grandchild would occasionally run into the room and shoo an errant chicken away. Whenever I looked away from Tanta Bess's lined, nutmeg-brown face, her white hair, and shrewd, glittering eyes, my eyes lighted on the mango and cherry trees in her front yard. Every now and then, when her voice trailed off into a hoarse whisper, I leaned forward to hear what she was saying, and I also heard the sound of one of the plump, blood-red cherries falling to the ground or the muted conversation of birds. 123. Echoing inside the room. Because of the way in which she spoke to me at first, I could not help concluding that in her silent ruminations she had grown accustomed to past events flashing across her mind, not in chronological order, but according to her mood at a particular moment. So her answers to my questions conformed to her own eccentric patterns of thought. Although I'd explained at our first meeting why I was interested in the story of Louise Langdon's childhood and youth in Grenada, for a week or so, after greeting me and placing a bowl of fruit in front of me, she would ask, "Why you so interested in Louise Langdon?" And knowing that village folk literally find it impossible to detach someone from the web of an extended family, I'd repeat respectfully. She had a famous son, and how can you know the truth about a son or daughter without first finding out who their mother was, and who her family and her husband's family were? After my third visit, her suspicions were finally allayed, and, rocking gently back and forth, she smiled and said, "I'm glad you come to keep an old lady company. Everybody busy these days, running around like chickens without a head. They never have time to listen." After a pause, she continued, "Yes, Louise was my friend. Granny Langdon, her grandmother, that is, used to tell everybody who had ears to hear that she warned Louise's mother to stay away from Norton, that hit-and-run white man who was sweet-talking her, but the young, own-way woman had hard ears, and she didn't listen. That good-for-nothing Norton man was a big shot on the island, and his eye used to catch fire for colored women. So he well scattered his seed all over the place and leave befuddled women to live with the fruits of his misdeeds. Louise's mother, may her soul rest in peace, was so bent on having her own way that she turned deaf ears to Granny Langdon's warnings. The good Lord blessed and cursed the women in that Langdon family with good looks and minds of their own. But one thing I can say about them, they didn't have a snobbish bone in their bodies, although Louise's mother was a brown woman like me. Because of the white man's blood in her veins, Louise looked like a mung-mung. They didn't ever make believe, in fact or fancy, that they 124 ghosts in had traveled to Montreal in 1917, the same year in which Louise Langdon had done so. When I was in my early teens, I remember him telling me jokingly that once they were on board the ship, my aunt was assigned to a cabin for whites only, while he had to be content with one close to the steerage. My aunt objected to being separated from her brother, and she was relegated to a for natives of color only section. When Louise boarded that ship for Canada, she too was called upon, for the first time in her life, to choose between being white or colored, and she also made the choice unhesitatingly. Both my aunt and Louise had been brought up in similar rural, middle-class, colonial settings where they were thoroughly creolized. They had made this choice even though the infinite gradations of class, color, caste, and status in their village societies were full of subtleties and complications. My aunt, who lived to 98, was never fully integrated into the North American society and its culture of racial discrimination, and after working as a nurse for 45 years she returned to Barbados to live out the final decades of her life. Louise, however, was integrated into American society through her uncle, her husband, her children, and her commitment to the struggle for black liberation. It was during the turbulent aftermath of World War I that my father mentioned in a letter to his sister that Garvey's philosophy of black pride, African liberation, and the return of the sons and daughters of the African diaspora to their ancestral motherland began to create seismic rumblings throughout the black world. The tremors of that Garveyite movement and its aftershocks affected 131. Black people not only in Canada and the United States but also in the Caribbean, Central and South America, Africa, and Europe. Louise first heard of Marcus Garvey from her uncle Egerton Langdon. In 1916, a year before she immigrated to Montreal, he had traveled to New York to visit friends in Harlem, and they had taken him to a meeting in St. Mark's Hall to hear Garvey speak. That meeting had marked a turning point in his life, and he began to spread the Garveyite message soon after his return to Montreal. It won a sympathetic response from members of the black community. That message has reverberated for 3/4 of a century, for today there is still a functioning chapter of Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association in Montreal. Louise Langdon Little, her uncle Edgerton Langdon, her husband Earl Little, as Garvey devotees and new converts, laid the foundation on which all the succeeding Black Power movements in Canada and the United States were built. Louise met Earl Little at a Garvey conference in Montreal. No one knows how long their courtship lasted. However, they were married in Montreal on May 10, 1919, 2 years after Louise arrived in Canada. In just over a decade of that marriage, Louise had 7 children by Earl Little. Wilfred was the eldest, and there followed Hilda, Filbert, Malcolm, Reginald, Yvonne, and Robert. The May 1919 marriage certificate confirms some interesting facts about Louise's early life. Her maiden name is recorded as Louise Norton, even though she had been known as Louise Langdon all of her life. Norton, in fact, was the name recorded on her birth certificate, but grandmother Gertrude Langdon had followed an Afro-Carib matriarchal tradition in which the mother's lineage is regarded as the only valid one. However, the Norton name on the birth certificate could have been legally changed only by deed poll, and this would have required the father's consent. Given Gertrude Langdon's pride in her family name and her contempt for Norton, she had obviously chosen to avoid asking Norton for his consent. As Louise's guardian, she had simply given the child her own and her mother's surname. 132. Louise Langdon Norton spent 2 years in Canada, and during that time, a distant Canadian relative told me, she did odd jobs as a shop assistant and a domestic. Her ability to speak French and her fair complexion, the informant told me, obviously helped her to find work. These years, however, were crucial in shaping the rest of her life in North America. But in the rush to embroider details in the life of her famous son, biographers have ignored or passed over many events that shaped her life and, through her, Malcolm's life. But there is also the fact that Louise arrived in Canada already steeped in the lore, the magic, the complex village culture of La Diga, with its codes of morality and its tradition of loyalty to family and place. Stepping off the gangplank of the ship that brought her to Montreal, Louise must have seen that in her journey from La Diga she had, in fact, not only sailed thousands of miles north, but had also leaped across centuries. My father, my aunt, and Louise Langdon, coming from their villages in the sun and seeing a metropolis like Montreal for the first time, must have viewed it with the same wonder. They must have felt the same apprehension about where they would find a human sanctuary in the midst of the city's monuments in stone and its towering buildings. For the first time, too, they must have been conscious of being dwarfed, not by cliffs, mountains, and forests but by man-made structures. But they would have brought an invincible certainty of who they were as human beings, and instinctively they would have looked not so much at the structures but at the kaleidoscope of human faces around them. A smile, a nod, a friendly greeting would have reassured them that they were still in a human world in which they were living beings. However, people moved around like ciphers and the sound of machines muted their voices. As they entered the intestines of the city, the streets would have grown wider and the buildings taller, more impersonal. Just as West Indian friends and relatives came to my father and aunt's rescue with their lively good humor, their volumes of advice. 133. And their eagerness to hear news from home, Louise's uncle and his friends would have subjected her to the same welcoming ritual. Soon after my father and aunt's arrival, my father got a job with the Canadian Pacific Railway, while she, traumatized by the cold and the daunting business of finding her way in a labyrinth of city streets, left for Tulsa, Oklahoma. She complained that the icy wind in those canyon streets made her feel as if she were breathing in splinters of glass. She had relatives in Tulsa, and they had arranged a job in a hospital for her. Louise survived the crossing much better than my aunt did. Although there is no record of her having done so, she must have worked in Montreal soon after her arrival. What is obvious, however, is that staying with her uncle, she had a crash course in the crucial basics of survival in a society in which the format of institutional racism was entirely different from the one in her semi-feudal Grenadine society. In retrospect, It is interesting to compare my father's reaction to racism in Montreal with that of Louise and her uncle. His art was his life, and he felt that the most effective way of answering those who sought to denigrate him because of his color was through his paintings and sculpture. Louise, on the other hand, deeply influenced by her grandmother's teachings and politicized by her uncle, entered the fray directly, and by the time she had married an activist in the Garvey movement they were fully aware of the risks involved in joining the black liberation struggle. In a profound sense, both my father and Louise had committed their lives and creative energies to the dangerous cause of freeing the souls of black folk from the thraldom of racial indignities and white contempt. His spirit was crushed slowly and remorselessly by indifference, while hers was mangled by violence, murder, and constant persecution. 8. We are the avengers of death. Our race will never be extinguished while there is light in the morning star. Popolva a month had gone by since Malcolm's LSE speech and my final conversations with him, and my habit of writing letters and neglecting to post them had caught up with me. As a result, I was left with a long letter that I had penned to Malcolm but had not mailed. For me, writing letters has always been a painful chore. It's how I imagine a postman feels about going for a walk after a long day of trudging from door to door with a heavy mailbag. My letters are never like the chatty, amusing, and light-hearted ones I often receive from friends. Mine are invariably long, and my incurable habit of storytelling turns them into a kind of anecdotal essay. It is either this or a business-like 10-line missive. Having written this letter to Malcolm and put it aside, I was glad that I'd never posted it because it would have arrived after he was assassinated and would most likely have been intercepted. Looking at my letter, I often speculated about the fate of letters from all over the world that must have been written to Malcolm and posted while he was still alive but that had arrived after his death. Some of those letters must have eventually reached his wife and the sister. 135. 136. Who had taken over the leadership of the OAAU, but others are most likely languishing in some secret archive where the passage of time will render them meaningless. There was also the strange phenomenon that occurs when a relative or friend dies in another country and you don't actually see the corpse or attend the funeral. A vague feeling lingers in your mind that somehow the person is permanently suspended in a twilight zone between the world of the living and that of the dead. Rereading my unposted letter more than 2 decades later, I could not help thinking of the hundreds of intimate questions I would like to have asked Malcolm. For despite our lengthy conversations, we had both avoided revealing an infinite number of fears, doubts, macabre fantasies, and private longings. I would have had to play Boswell to his Johnson for a number of years in order to plumb depths that the short time of our acquaintance had never allowed us to do. In retrospect, I'm particularly sorry that we didn't talk about the women in his life, because the way in which men in general, but black men in particular, talk about women when no females are within earshot tells you a great deal more about the men themselves than about the women they're discussing. I'd been tempted several times to ask Malcolm about his days as an outlaw and about how his being a father and loving husband squared with his decision to die for the cause he believed in so passionately. But I never had the chance. 58, Ridgeway Place, London, SW19. Dear Malcolm, your visit was all too short, but folks speak about you as though you'd never left. During our talks, so much was left out, and before we parted you'd asked me to write. I had the distinct impression that one of the results of our meeting, and your 2 recent visits to Britain, is that you're keen on finding out more about the West Indian side of your family history. There are a lot of Grenadines. 137. Here in Britain, and I've already asked some of the older folk among them to find out what they can about your mother's family. You also asked me to tell you more about my own family background, so I'll do that in some detail for you. But let me begin with current events. I gave up the editorship of Magnet shortly after your departure. The moment the chaps who'd put up the funds to launch the paper saw that it was a success, they went behind my back and tried to sell it to a large corporation. Such are the foibles of the black struggle. Pious rhetoric in public, greed and betrayal in private. You'll notice from the enclosed copy that they attacked you in the first issue after I left. They're trying to suck up to the white establishment, but they're doing it in such a sleazy fashion that no one's taking them seriously. They don't seem to realize that Uncle Toming from the heart has to be done according to established rules, the first and most important being that you must not appear to be doing it. A group of us had formed a cooperative, and we tried to buy Magnet, but we couldn't raise enough money. What a pity. The dark million in this country deserve better than a badly written, badly produced, and craven rag. In that illuminating LSE speech of yours, you moved the political discourse from nationalism to internationalism, and from civil rights to human rights. You stated categorically that the struggle against racism and colonialism must be moved into an international arena so that it becomes internationalized rather than ghettoized. Listening to you, I remembered a passage from Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism. Talking about the victims of racism and colonialism, he said, "I am talking of millions of men who have been skillfully injected with fear, inferiority complexes, trepidation, servility, despair, and abasement. Your visits were short, but your words will echo and reecho in the minds of generations of black folk in this country. You had asked me to tell you more about myself, but I could only give you snippets of information. It was more urgent, more important to hear your story. You said that you wished you had had my formal education. Well, isn't that strange, because I envy. 38. Your life as an outlaw, your conversion to Islam, your austere lifestyle, and your single-mindedness. Your asceticism, your unflinching belief in an omnipotent Allah, the Lord of worlds, had an almost mesmeric effect on me, and how I wished that I could embrace a religion with the same passion and certainty. But I also have to admit to myself that a lot of these longings to be like you are romantic and illusory. I have a third, iconoclastic, intellectual, and doubting Thomas I that invariably topples gods from their pedestals, that vivisects certainties, and that adds complexity to what, on the surface, seems simple. Alas, I cannot be you, and you cannot be me, and even if we could meld the two selves into one, internal contradictions would tear the hybrid creation apart. I sensed that by wanting to hear about my life in Guyana and my experiences abroad, you were acknowledging a need to find out more about the West Indian part of you. One of the things that occurred to me after you left is this: your mother had immigrated to Canada during World War I, and so had my father. They might have traveled on the same ship. Who knows? I remember his telling me how the ship taking him from Georgetown to Halifax had stopped at several islands along the way, and how they had to dodge German submarines, particularly in that long run between Cape Hatteras and Nova Scotia. He also told me that he had been called up to serve in the Canadian Army but had, mercifully, failed the medical examination. You see, the story of West Indian migrations has a sameness to it. I grew up in a village on the Guyana coast. This village with its rainbow array of peoples, African, Amerindian, Hindu, Muslim, Portuguese, Creoles of every shade, was called Agricola Rome. My grandfather was a schoolmaster in Agricola. When he died, my mother, who was a schoolteacher, found life in Agricola stultifying, so she wrote to her brothers in the United States. One was a lawyer and the other a Wesleyan minister, and they sponsored our move to New York. My father had already spent years in the US and Canada and was not keen on returning, but my mother's word was law in the family, and he simply towed the line when she brushed aside his objections. Stephanie, my eldest sister, was 139. I was 5, and Maudie, the youngest, was 2, when we migrated to the States. Agricola Rome would have been like the village where your mother grew up in rural Grenada. These villages sprang up all over the Caribbean and the Guianas after slavery was abolished. It was Africans, Du Bois tells us, who in ancient times first created the village as a viable communal and social unit. So our creolized African ancestors, dipping into a pool of primordial memories, began setting up villages as soon as they had won their freedom. Once the villages were set up, the colonial authorities stepped in and set up their own governmental hierarchy with a village council and a village chairman, all of whom were appointed. That official hierarchy, of course, included a magistrate and a police sergeant. On the other hand, the people, while paying lip service to the officially anointed leaders, had their own secret hierarchy of healers, priests, and teachers. The sole authority figure they recognized above all others was the village schoolmaster or schoolmistress. They accorded to that person a reverence that bordered on awe. They were convinced that through education they could win for themselves a second emancipation and, this time, an absolute freedom from ignorance, poverty, and racial contempt. It was this tradition that shaped your mother's views when she was growing up in La Diga. My maternal grandfather, the village schoolmaster, was a tall, commanding figure, and when he walked down the main street of the village, even the most cantankerous and loud-mouthed of the rum shop denizens would lower their voices and tip their hats. He taught me my first anti-colonial lessons, and my first lessons in racial pride. My maternal grandmother, the schoolmaster's wife, died before I was born, but the stories I constantly heard about her and a portrait in the living room kept her alive in my imagination. My grandfather had a voice like the roll of drums, and I can still hear it commanding me from age 4 onwards to stand up straight. You're descended from African kings and queens and Carib chieftains. He was an early African nationalist and insisted on having my mother hang pictures of House of Fulani warriors. 40. Above my bed. Their proud ebony faces, snow-white eyeballs, lily-white turbans, decorously coppery-sewn steeds, and pennant lances remain imprinted on my mind to this day. The Tarzan images to which I was exposed later were never able to supplant these memorable ones. My earliest impressions of Africa were shaped by those pictures of House of Fulani cavalrymen. I'm forever grateful to my grandfather for ensuring that those were the images that were etched on my mind during very impressionable years. After my grandfather's death in 1926, my mother, father, 2 sisters, and I migrated to New York. We lived in an apartment on Morningside Avenue in Harlem, and I can still recall how every gray facaded building on our street looked the same, especially at night when lights filtering through curtains glowed like tigers' eyes. During our second year in the United States, Maudie was kidnapped, and I remember every detail of that drama. It was a cool afternoon and sunlight flooded the street after a cloudy spell. My 2 sisters and I were playing on the sidewalk, and my mother would check on us every now and then from an open second-floor window. A red car drove up and a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat that sat on his head like a doll's house rushed out, grabbed Maudie, bundled her into the red car, and sped away. Only after the red car had disappeared around the corner did Stephanie and I find our voices and call out to our mother. After Maudie's disappearance, Stephanie and I were immediately shipped back to Georgetown, Guyana's capital. My distraught parents did everything possible to find Maudie, but they never did. A year later, though, when they were certain that they'd never see her again, a close Guyanese friend of my mother's saw Maudie playing on the beach in Florida, recognized her, and called the police. There was a surprising twist to Maudie's return to the family fold, because the woman who had paid 2 men to kidnap her had actually treated her so well that she cried for days, protesting loudly that she wanted to go back to Mama. Young as Maudie was, and innocent, my mother still never forgave her for transferring her affection to a kidnapper. 141. Back in Georgetown, my sisters and I spent a year and a half with Aunt Harriet, my mother's eldest sister. She had married the Reverend Marcellus Joseph, a Wesleyan minister. His midnight complexion contrasted with her high yellow one. Ebony and white pine, malicious members of the congregation would whisper behind their backs. But as far as Aunt Harriet was concerned, class and status were always more important than color, and Uncle Marcellus, who had studied at a seminary in England, was a respected man of the cloth. When Uncle Marcellus was transferred to Suriname, Aunt Harriet took us along with them to Paramaribo, where we lived in a large Wesleyan manse. To get there, we sailed along the South American coast in a ship that rolled and heaved and pitched until my stomach was vacuumed of all its contents. I remember Uncle Marcellus telling us that in Suriname we'd be closer to Africa than we were in Guyana, and I understood what he was saying on my first visit to the market in Paramaribo. I remember going to that noisy, colorful market with a maid whose father was a Maroon and whose mother was Amerindian. She bargained with Maroon hagglers, laughed, exchanged banter, and now and then spoke in whispers. Those Maroons, whose ancestors had been captured in Africa and brought to Suriname as slaves, had fought and won their freedom from slavery 2 centuries before. They also successfully transplanted their African languages and cultures in the Americas. Theirs was a culture of resistance to tyranny and, at the same time, one that simultaneously affirmed the genius of the African peoples and their humanity. The Maroon communities that those suffering from overdoses of racial chauvinism and cultural myopia dismiss as being backward are still, in fact, some of the most creative in the Americas. A collective artistic expression: music, song, complex rituals, dance, sculpture, concepts of how the human world was first created with a diverse array of communities living in harmony with one another and with nature is as much a part of the Maroon cosmology as the breath of life. If, as the descendants of slaves, we hold distorted images of ourselves, then we need to take a new look at ourselves through the 142 ghosts in OIR blood eyes of these brothers and sisters who corrected those distortions centuries ago. That maid, once she was around her Maroon friends and relatives, relaxed and was no longer the straight-laced young woman who had been brought up by Moravian missionaries. As she led me from one stall to the other, the market became a magical place that was rainbowed with color, alive with voices and pulsing with life. It was a place where dreams and reality collided and touched the most prosaic of objects with magic. She pointed out the vendors who were selling potent love potions extracted from perfumed chuil blossoms. Exquisitely carved wooden dishes, ladles, doors, paddles, furniture, and every intricately wrought design was different. Then there were herbs that could cure fevers, poultices that could soften bones and make bowed legs straight, even herbal medicines that could resuscitate a heart that had stopped beating. After that visit to the market, I could always spot the Maroons in the city, not only by their distinctive African attire but by the way in which they walked in single file as though following a forest trail. We had hardly spent a year and a half in Paramaribo when our gentle, soft-spoken Uncle Marcellus died in his sleep, and once again the unkind, tossing ship plowed its way along the coast of the Guianas and took us back to Georgetown. After a year of widowhood, Aunt Harriet announced that she was about to get married again, this time to a Moravian minister. This meant that my parents had to return from the United States post-haste. I grew up being constantly regaled with stories about the racial discrimination my parents had faced in North America. I remember my mother lamenting again and again that in America, although she was earning good money, she often found herself drowning in a white indifference. She worked as a housekeeper for a rich white family, and her employers didn't mind her going to night classes at Columbia University to study home economics. During the same period, my father studied dentistry at a southern black university, and spent a few days with us every couple of months. He often joked about the 143 variety of odd jobs he had done. He claimed that one of his most macabre jobs had been with a mortician who sold black corpses to teaching hospitals. My mother liked to tell this story about the first time she boarded a bus south of the Mason-Dixon line. She repeated it so often that I came to know it by heart. I paid my fare and sat down in the first vacant seat my eyes lighted on. Then this uncouth human beast of a bus driver called me names and ordered me to the back of the bus. I couldn't believe my ears. And you know something, for the first time in my life, I felt that I wanted to kill another human being, but I thought about my children and the good-for-nothing father I'd have to leave them with, so I kept my anger in check and moved. But it was there and then that I decided that pride and poverty were better than money and bile rising up in your throat to choke you every time one of those human beasts decided to mash up your pride and fling insult and injury in your face. My mother said that the couple she worked for was so busy living it up that they had no time for their 2 children. So the boy and the girl the boy was 4 and his sister 8 were left entirely in her hands. When my mother broke the news that her eldest sister, who was looking after us, was about to get married and she would therefore have to return to Guyana, the family offered to pay our passages back to the US and to underwrite all the costs of our upbringing and education. But my mother was congenitally unsuited to being a servant. Besides, there was a wild, reckless streak in her, and she hated being tied down anywhere for long. She dramatized the whole affair by declaring, "It's better to catch hell in Brutishgena than to live as a servant in the Yankeeman's heaven." What a place that Yankeeland is! Millions of people around you, you don't know them from Adam, and they don't know you, and yet they hate you just because of the color of your skin. Friends had told me what to expect beforehand, but I didn't believe them until I actually set foot there. My father eventually graduated as a dentist, and this was after 144 ghosts in OIR blood being persistently badgered by my mother to complete his studies. When he returned to Guyana, however, he never practiced dentistry for a single day. This was the first time that he had dared to rebel openly against my mother. The second rebellion that he staged was when he returned from abroad for the last time, withdrew into himself, sat on the veranda for months smoking his ornate pipe, and willed himself to die. He claimed that during his final months as a dental student, he had developed a phobia about staring into the open mouths of an endless stream of patients. In his imagination, those cavernous, putrid-smelling mouths would grow larger and larger, threatening to swallow him. He chose instead to be a tailor, a sculptor, and an artist. As far as my mother was concerned, tailoring was a lower-class profession, and tailor shops were places where all kinds of ne'er-do-wells and good-for-nothings congregated. And as for painting and sculpture, these were activities that should be left to carpenters and master builders, because to separate them from more useful and responsible activities like designing, building, and decorating houses would inevitably lead to a form of delinquency. My mother often swore that if she'd known beforehand that my father had been apprenticed to a tailor as a young man, that he'd painted designs on carriages and was a skilled woodcarver, she would never have married him. "He's a secretive man," she would lament, "and there are times when even Jesus of Nazareth couldn't tell what's going on in that closed Carib mind of his." The final secret that he'd kept from her, that he'd held on to his Catholic faith all of his life, was revealed only on his deathbed when he asked her to fetch a priest. The priest came, mumbled prayers in Latin, and lit a candle that burned by his bedside until Mantop's breath blew it out. When it suited her, my mother would attribute everything, good and bad, to the different bloods that ran in my father's veins and, of course, in my sister's and mine. She'd say, secretiveness, a heavy burden of patience, laughter as some kind of salve to cover up the 145 pain that's biding inside our bellies, and stubborn hope are what we inherited from our devil's cauldron of ancestral bloods. When she was angry with me and I tried to make myself scarce, she'd summon me and say, "You're standing there quiet as a mouse and looking contrite, but don't you fool yourself that I can't hear you thinking. You're growing up to be just like your father, always burying thoughts deep inside your mind. You're not burying any thoughts with me around, Mr. Man." That was the name she gave me when she was really angry, and, invariably, a slap would accompany the name. If I did well at school, this was attributed to our Jewish blood, but she'd add a rider to her praise, saying, "Book learning and life-manship are two different things. Jews are supposed to be clever and good at making money, but we had a lot of clever people in this family and not one of them ever made any money to speak of. Besides, those who managed to make a little money could never hold on to it. So try and break the tradition by mastering the book learning and having some glue in your palms." Stubbornness and duplicity were blamed on our English blood. How else do you think the English were able to grab an empire and vampire its riches for so long? She'd ask, raising her eyes toward the heavens, and then she'd answer the question. They had to lie and cheat and steal whole countries, and they learned how to do this in their cradles. God knows, if we could drain some of the unwanted blood out of my veins, the English blood would be the first to go. And as for the Scottish blood, that first Robertson man who came to Berbice was anxious to dip his wick and light a fire between the legs of women of every color and shade. But to give him his due, once he settled down, he founded a school, gathered his brood of bastards around him, and saw to it that they all got a solid education. The English hated him, and he hated them right back. And anyone the English hated qualified as a candidate for his friendship. Everything my father did turned out to be successful at first, but financial success invariably brought on moods of grim depression and bouts of melancholy. As a result, all of his enterprises, owning a general store in Georgetown, working as a tailor and abandoning this to become a gentleman farmer, all simply died from neglect. As he grew older, wood carving and graphic art became his twin passions. However, he never tried to sell a single one of his works, and if anyone offered to pay him for one of his drawings, he'd refuse the money and give it to them free of charge. On the other hand, with money he could ill afford, he'd pay cartmen to transport driftwood from the seashore to our backyard, and with chisel and hammer call forth faces, fluid shapes, twisted, writhing arms and legs, and snakes coiling around naked bodies. He never finished any of the carvings he started. As soon as a new piece of driftwood arrived, he abandoned the one on which he was working and gave this newly installed piece his full attention. He'd walk around it and touch it and run his fingertips along the grain of the wood until he found the exact spot where he would probe with his hammer and chisel. On moonlight nights, the backyard became a magical place with demon shapes and dark blue shadows. Once, when I could not sleep, I looked out of the window and saw my father standing in the midst of his magical, petrified garden. I heard the clock strike 2, but he did not move. His shadow striped the dew-spangled grass, and he could have been a shaman performing a strange and secret ritual. I remember hearing my mother calling out softly, "Come to bed, Alan, you'll catch cold standing in that early morning dew." The gentleness in her voice surprised me. I had never heard her speak to him with such tenderness and affection. And I thought, perhaps they both live a secret life in the early hours of the morning, one that was hidden from me and my sisters and far removed from her daytime ritual of carping, disapproval, and criticism of my father's every thought, word, and deed. I realize that I've gone on a bit about my family, but family stories are like that. They can take on a life of their own. The racial situation here in Britain is going from bad to worse. The other morning when the sun was out and I was walking down the Wimbledon High Street with a friend, a car slowed down and 2 men began screaming, "Nigger, go back to your jungle." And 147. Then they sped away. Do you know, on that clear bright morning, it was as if those 2 human beasts had polluted the air with their insane hatred. I remembered your idea of having a register listing blacks everywhere in the world with professional skills, and I've been jotting down names since you left. I hope that the OAAU is going from strength to strength. Warmest fraternal greetings, Jan 9. His face is on the earth, his drum is silent. In the cold dark earth time plants seeds of anger. Martin Carter, Death of a Slave. After talking to Wilfred on many occasions, I was most impressed by his quiet strength and his dedication to serving the community. In his 70s, he was still doing what he had done for most of his adult life, helping young people in Detroit to realize their full potential. He had served for years as a Muslim minister and had then been employed by Michigan Bell, where, with only a high school education, he had risen steadily in the corporate ranks. When he retired, the company and the community had honored him. He was a big brother not only within his family, but for the community as a whole. There are some white people at the top who will recognize intelligence, no matter what color it is, he said, but the disadvantaged whites and blacks are being manipulated from the summit of a pyramid and encouraged to rival one another. If the poor whites and poor blacks could ever unite for the same cause, they would overcome their oppression in no time. How did you start working for Michigan Bell? I asked, intrigued by the switch from being a Muslim minister to joining the ranks of corporate America. There was this young man whom I coached for his interview, and after he got the job with Michigan Bell, the personnel manager complimented him on the way in which he conducted himself during the interview. Well, to tell you the truth, this young man said, a friend named Wilfred Little coached me. That was a time when they were interested in employing more blacks in the company, so this personnel man said, "This Wilfred Little should be working for us. You should try and persuade him to come and see me." So I went to see this man, and when I took the tests I came out at the top of the group of applicants, although all of them had more formal education than I had. I got the job, and I would have risen higher in the company if I hadn't started so late in life. Every job I ever had in my life, I gave all I had into doing it. I had learned during my wide-ranging conversations with Wilfred that asking the odd question every now and then was the best way of triggering a flow of random but illuminating reminiscences. Speaking in his calm fashion, either face-to-face or on the phone, he would, over time, fill in gaps that remained after our previous talks. Once he began talking, I would let him range back and forth, from his earliest recollections of his mother and of Malcolm, to past and present happenings in his own life. The absence of a rigidly structured time frame that placed everything in chronological order proved just as rewarding as the talks with Tanta Bess had been. Once, almost as an aside, Wilfred had slipped in an important and intriguing piece of information. He told me that Marcus Garvey had visited their home on a few occasions. What did he look like? I asked him. I was young, almost a child, and my memory of him isn't clear. But he was a big man, and when he spoke he had that Jamaican accent. What I remember more clearly, though, is that my mother told me that the aide traveling with Garvey was her cousin. That aide accompanied him wherever he went, and I'm sure that from the way he looked, he must have had Indian blood. But I must tell you. 151. That when Garvey was on the run from the FBI, my mother hid him in our house and wrote letters and dispatched for him. She had a good education and could write clearly and well, and a couple of times she received commendations from the leaders of the UNIA thanking her for the good work she had done for that movement. Then, with hardly a pause, he switched to an entirely different topic and declared, "Malcolm demanded attention from the day he was born." I remember that when my mother brought him home from the hospital in Omaha, Nebraska, he used to bawl his head off, and my mother would say, "Wilfred, give this child the bottle, I don't have enough milk to breastfeed him the way he wants me to," and with Malcolm red in the face and making himself heard, she'd say, "This one is going to grow up to talk to people." She had a way of forecasting what each of us would do from early on, and every one of her predictions came out just like she said. "What did she predict that you would do?" I asked. "She said that in my quiet way, I'd always be helping those in need. I'm a careful person, never owed a debt in my life that I didn't repay." "You must have done something reckless in your youth," I said. He laughed and confessed, "I'll tell you what the most reckless thing I did was. When I was a boy, we had a neighbor who made 50-gallon barrels of cherry wine. It would start out as cherry juice because the old folks used to say that cherry juice was good for people suffering from rheumatism. When that juice fermented, it became cherry wine, and they claimed that that was good for rheumatism, too. So when people knew that it was ready they would come, and you would think there was nothing in the world like cherry wine. 'Oh, it's so great,' they'd say. So, I wondered, if this stuff is so great, how come they keep saying that children shouldn't drink it? So one day I figured out how I was going to get some. There's a weed that grows out in the field, it grows up straight and has some greenery on top of it. When you break it off and it dries, the inside of it has some cottony stuff, but you hit it against something and all that white stuff comes out, and you have a long drinking straw." I went down into the neighbor's basement. 152. Inserted my straw into the barrel, and sucked away. And boy, it tasted good. I'd go sit down a while and rest, and then go back and get some more. When I finally got ready to go back upstairs, I could hardly make it up the stairs. When I did make it, and came out into our kitchen, my mother looked at me and asked, "What's wrong with you?" She could see that something was wrong, but I managed to stagger to my room, and every time I looked at my bed it seemed to be moving. I got next to it where I could feel it and just fell over and went to sleep. Next morning when I woke up, I drank some water, and by drinking that water I was drunk again. So my mother got me straightened out that day, but I told her she would never have to worry about me and that stuff anymore. I've stayed away from alcohol ever since. People used to laugh at me, but I just didn't care. I said to myself, you and Malcolm were opposites, Wilfred. You moved through life at a steady pace, always testing the ground before you moved forward, but he was reckless, where you were cautious. He wanted to fly like the wind. As if reading my thoughts, Wilfred said, I've met a lot of people in my lifetime, but I'm telling you, Malcolm had the quickest mind of anyone I ever met. His mind worked like lightning. Almost before the words had left your mouth, he had grasped the idea. That was the way he was. He could see right into what you were saying, right to the heart of it. He found out early that in schools they give you all this idealism and everything, but when you get out into the real world where black folks are always up against it, you find out that it is a whole different way that this world is run out there. Out in that real, white male-dominated world, there's lying and deceiving, cheating and murder, and one illusion piled on top of the other. So it's not what people think it is, and the masses are being manipulated and don't even know it. How do you think that you can convince thousands of young men to go and give their lives for some patriotic reason, when all it boils down to is that they're being sent to protect somebody's interest and to take control of someone else's resources? Malcolm found this out earlier than most. He knew from the inside how the system works. He studied. 153. Everything from the inside. If he saw just the outside, he would never have known it the way he did, and he couldn't have spoken out and told the truth about it the way he did either. Malcolm could stand at a street corner in any city and tell you every hustle that was going on, who was doing what, which cops were on the take, who the undercover cops were. He could read the happenings in a city like a book. He was paroled to me when he was released from prison. People often ask, which one of the family was he closest to? Well, he was close to all of us in different ways. But he'd confide in me because he knew that whatever he told me would stop there, so he felt like he could tell me anything, even his wrongdoings. Sometimes I would try and dissuade him, but he had to do what he set his mind on doing, and he knew I was always there for him. Many times he would tell me, if you ever hear that I'm in jail, come and bail me out, because if you leave me in there, they'll find somebody to frame me for whatever they want to charge me with. They know that they can pick me up and hold me in jail for 3 days with no charge, and if they didn't charge me during that time, they'd have to release me. So he'd get caught in those places where he would hustle. White people would come to those joints to buy marijuana and stuff. Anything they wanted, he knew where to get it for them. Every now and then, they'd run a raid on those places and take him to jail, but he'd get word to me, and I'd go and get him out right away. As far as I can remember, he didn't really start having problems and getting involved in things until he was around 17. I always felt that he'd wake up one day and walk away from that gangster world, and prison did this for him. He didn't just serve time, he let time serve him. When he was paroled to me, I got him a job in the furniture store where I was working. I remember that when he held the first paycheck in his hand, he turned to me in amazement and said, I could earn this in 5 minutes on the street. But he moved forward and never looked back. You know, every now and then, when fame had caught up with him, he'd talk to an all-black audience when there were no whites in sight, and he would get right down to business. Now listen, he would say, there's nobody here but us, so we're going to have a good old down-home talk. Then he would tell them how uncouth they were. Yes, he'd use the word uncouth, and he would show them how a lot of the problems they had were things they perpetrated against themselves and tell them that they had it in their power to overcome their problems. That's why I tell students all the time it's a family legacy to go into the community and try to show young people how to rise above the conditions they find themselves in. I still get mad when one of them comes and tells me, I can't do this, and I can't do that, because I'm black. We've been so brainwashed. A lot of things we accept that we can't do, we really can do if we try. Once, when Wilfred had said something about the mystical side of Islam, I asked, "Are you still a Muslim?" "I'm a believer in Islam," was his rejoinder, and I understood that he was making it clear that he wanted to distance himself from the movement that Elijah Muhammad had started and to which he had devoted so many years of his life, so much of his energies, and the quiet dedication that was as much a part of him as the sweat in his pores. "You were a black Muslim in the early days, before Malcolm burst on the scene, weren't you?" I asked. "I'll tell you how I became a Muslim. There was a guy who I helped, and he said to me, 'You must be a Muslim.' I never heard about Muslims before, so I asked him where these Muslims were located, and he told me. I went there and liked what they were saying, and I joined up. But it was a small movement then. It took Malcolm to make it a nationwide movement, to found a newspaper, to create the Fruit of Islam, though some of the people he recruited turned on him like vipers. Malcolm made the movement rich and powerful, then jealousies began creeping in. There were little men who couldn't bear the idea of Malcolm being a national and international figure. I used to try and warn him about what was going on, but he wouldn't listen. Malcolm was a reincarnated Othello surrounded by Iagos, I thought, and Wilfred's voice continued. When he broke with Elijah Muhammad, he came to see me. 155. And when he stepped off that plane, I had never seen him looking so devastated. It was as if someone close to him had died. I saw him after all of his trips abroad except the last one. After that last trip, he only told me what had happened in France. During our talks at the Mount Royal Hotel in London, he told me that the forces stalking him at every turn were too big to be just the followers of Elijah Muhammad, I said, and he agreed immediately, "Oh, yes, there's no question of it." He became especially aware of it when he was traveling in Africa. Nasser tried to see to it that there was enough protection to ensure that he didn't fall victim to some of their schemes. Malcolm knew that there was much more to it than just black Muslims looking for revenge. Some of the ordinary folk who worked for American diplomats would tip him off. Lots of times, the ordinary folk working for those diplomats, cleaning up and doing things like that, would hear them discussing things. So those very folk who they thought didn't know anything would be listening, and they'd put the word out as to what was being discussed, that there were higher ups in America who wanted to see Malcolm eliminated, because they didn't want him hauling them before the United Nations. He wasn't hiding the fact that he intended to do it, and they knew that he knew how to do it. Besides, they killed him when he and Martin were getting together and when some world leaders were reaching out to help him. Afterwards, they sent their people around Africa to try and sully his name. But the name of Malcolm X still lives. The last time I saw Malcolm X, he was in the lobby of the Mount Royal Hotel, surrounded by reporters, leaders of the Council of African Organizations and a bevy of camp followers. We greeted each other fleetingly. There was a handshake, a smile, and a hasty reminder, "Remember to send those things to me," he said, hurrying away, and not looking back. He was assassinated 10 days later. About the author. Born in Guyana in 1925, Jan Carew is a novelist, poet, playwright, journalist, critic, and historian. Currently the director of the Center for the Comparative Study of the Humanities at Lincoln University, he taught at Northwestern University for 15 years, where he is now Emeritus Professor of African American and Third World Studies, and previously at Princeton, Rutgers, and George Mason Universities. Carew, whose first novel, Black Midas, was a landmark in Caribbean literature, has been an advisor to heads of state in Africa and the Caribbean. A member of the board of the international journal Race and Class, his essay entitled The Caribbean Writer and Exile was awarded the 1979-1980 Pushcart Prize.